The rugged peaks and deep valleys of the central Zagros Mountains, stretching across what is now western Iran, provided the ancestral homeland for one of ancient Mesopotamia's most enigmatic peoples. The Gutians emerged from this harsh highland environment sometime during the late 4th millennium BC, their tribal communities scattered across the mountainous terrain that would shape their nomadic lifestyle and military prowess for centuries to come. Archaeological investigations across the central Zagros have revealed a complex pattern of early settlement that suggests the Proto-Gutian communities were far from primitive mountain dwellers. The site of Godin Tepe, located in the Kangavar Valley of western Iran, stands as perhaps the most significant archaeological window into these early highland societies. Excavations have uncovered stratified deposits dating from the 5th millennium BC through the Islamic period, providing crucial insights into the material culture and social organization of the region's inhabitants. The 4th period levels at Godin Tepe, dating to approximately 3500–2900 BC, reveal sophisticated ceramic traditions that would later characterize Gutian material culture. These assemblages include distinctive grey-black burnished wares with geometric incised decorations, alongside red-slip vessels bearing painted motifs. The pottery displays clear technological advancement, with evidence of controlled firing techniques and standardized vessel forms that suggest organized craft production. Storage jars of considerable size indicate surplus agricultural production, while smaller serving vessels point to structured social gatherings and possibly ritualistic activities. The architectural remains from this period demonstrate substantial construction techniques adapted to the mountainous environment. Stone foundations supported mud brick superstructures, with walls often exceeding 1 meter in thickness to withstand the region's harsh winters and seismic activity. Room layouts follow functional patterns, with central hearths surrounded by storage areas and sleeping quarters. The presence of grinding stones, mortars and pestles throughout these structures indicates intensive food processing activities, particularly the preparation of cereals and the processing of wild plant resources abundant in the Zagros ecosystem. Metallurgical evidence from Godin Tepe and related sites reveals that Proto-Gutian communities possessed advanced knowledge of copper, working by the early 3rd millennium BC. Crucible fragments, slag deposits, and finished copper tools demonstrate local production capabilities rather than mere trade acquisition. Bronze technology appears somewhat later, coinciding with increased contact with Mesopotamian centers where tin-bronze alloys were becoming standard. The quality of metalwork found in highland sites suggests that Gutian smiths developed distinctive techniques suited to their available raw materials and cultural preferences. The subsistence economy of these early highland communities combined pastoral nomadism with seasonal agriculture, a pattern that would remain characteristic of Gutian society throughout their historical presence. Faunal remains from excavated sites show heavy reliance on sheep and goats, animals well adapted to the steep terrain and sparse vegetation of the Zagros slopes. Cattle bones appear less frequently but indicate the maintenance of small herds in valley locations where grazing conditions permitted. Wild game, including deer, wild boar, and various smaller mammals, supplemented the pastoral economy and provided materials for tool production and decorative arts. Agricultural practices focused on hardy cereals capable of surviving the region's variable climate conditions. Barley predominated, with wheat cultivation limited to areas with reliable water sources. The discovery of irrigation channels and terraced field systems at several sites indicates sophisticated water management techniques developed to maximize agricultural productivity in the challenging mountain environment. These innovations would prove crucial as Gutian populations expanded and required more reliable food sources to support larger communities. The linguistic identity of the Gutians presents one of the most perplexing problems in ancient Near Eastern studies. The Gutian language remains poorly attested, known primarily through personal names and a handful of terms preserved in Mesopotamian texts. Unlike their contemporaries who spoke well-documented languages such as Sumerian, Akkadian, or Elamite, the Gutians left no substantial written records in their own tongue. This linguistic isolation has led to extensive scholarly debate regarding their ethnic and cultural affiliations. Several theories have emerged regarding potential connections between Gutian and other ancient languages of the region. Some scholars have proposed links to the Hurrian language family, pointing to certain phonetic similarities in preserved personal names. Others suggest possible relationships with Proto-Kurdish or other Iranian language groups, though the chronological gap makes such connections highly speculative. The presence of certain linguistic elements that appear neither Semitic nor Indo-European has led to suggestions that Gutian might represent a substrate language predating the major linguistic families that later dominated the region. The onomastic evidence, while limited, provides intriguing clues about Gutian linguistic structure. Personal names such as Eridupesir, Imta, and Tirigan show patterns that differ markedly from contemporary Mesopotamian naming conventions. The frequent appearance of certain syllabic combinations and the apparent absence of typical Semitic or Sumerian morphological features suggest a distinct linguistic tradition. However, the possibility that these names represent adaptations or corruptions of original Gutian forms by Mesopotamian scribes complicates any definitive linguistic analysis. Trade relationships between the highland Gutian communities and the Mesopotamian city-states developed gradually during the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BC. The Zagros Mountains contained valuable resources highly sought by lowland civilizations, including metals, stone, timber, and various organic materials unavailable in the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia. Copper ores were particularly abundant in certain Zagros locations, and evidence suggests that Proto-Gutian communities controlled access to several important mining areas. The establishment of trade routes through these Zagros passes required intimate knowledge of mountain geography and seasonal weather patterns. Gutian groups, with their familiarity with highland terrain and mobile lifestyle, were ideally positioned to facilitate this commerce. Archaeological evidence from sites along suspected trade corridors shows increasing quantities of Mesopotamian manufactured goods, particularly textiles, finished metal objects and luxury items, appearing in highland context during the 3rd millennium BC. Seasonal migration patterns played a crucial role in facilitating contact between Gutian communities and Mesopotamian settlements. The harsh Zagros winters forced pastoral groups to seek lower elevations where grazing remained possible and temperatures were more moderate. These seasonal movements brought Gutian herders into proximity with the northern reaches of Mesopotamian territory, creating opportunities for both peaceful exchange and potential conflict. The evidence suggests that these early interactions were primarily economic rather than military in nature. Mesopotamian texts from the early dynastic period occasionally mention mountain peoples bringing livestock, metals, and other highland products to lowland markets. The regularity of such references indicates established patterns of exchange rather than sporadic raiding or conquest. Gutian traders appear to have developed working relationships with specific city-states, particularly those located along the eastern periphery of Mesopotamian territory. Material evidence for these trade relationships appears in the archaeological record of both regions. Mesopotamian cylinder seals, pottery styles, and decorative motifs begin appearing in highland sites during this period, while highland products become more common in lowland archaeological assemblages. The adoption of certain Mesopotamian technological innovations by highland communities, particularly in metallurgy and textile production, demonstrates the transfer of knowledge along with goods. The social organization of early Gutian communities appears to have been tribal in nature, with leadership based on kinship relationships and military prowess, rather than the complex bureaucratic hierarchies characteristic of Mesopotamian city-states. Archaeological evidence suggests relatively egalitarian societies with limited social stratification, though certain individuals clearly possessed greater wealth and status as indicated by burial goods and residential architecture. The absence of monumental architecture or large-scale public works projects in early Gutian sites contrasts sharply with contemporary developments in Mesopotamia. This difference likely reflects both the nomadic lifestyle of many Gutian groups and their different social values and organizational principles. The emphasis appears to have been on mobility and adaptability, rather than the creation of permanent urban centres. Religious practices among early Gutian communities remain largely mysterious due to the lack of written sources and the limited preservation of ritual artefacts. However, archaeological evidence suggests reverence for natural features, particularly mountain peaks and water sources, which would be consistent with the religious traditions of many highland pastoral societies. Small figurines and ritual objects found in domestic contexts indicate household-level religious practices, while the absence of large temple complexes suggests decentralized religious organization. The military capabilities of Gutian groups were already becoming apparent during this early period, though large-scale military campaigns would not emerge until later centuries. The mountainous terrain of their homeland provided natural defensive advantages, while also fostering the development of guerrilla warfare techniques that would prove highly effective against the more conventional armies of Mesopotamian city-states. The mobility afforded by their pastoral lifestyle allowed Gutian forces to strike quickly and withdraw to inaccessible mountain strongholds when faced with superior numbers. The collapse of centralized Akkadian authority under Shaka-li-Shari around 2154 BC created a power vacuum that fundamentally altered the political landscape of Mesopotamia. The last effective ruler of the Akkadian dynasty, Shaka-li-Shari, had struggled throughout his reign to maintain control over the vast territories conquered by his predecessors Sargon and Naram-Sin. His death marked the end of nearly 2 centuries of Akkadian hegemony and opened the door for various regional powers to assert their independence or expand their influence into formerly Akkadian territories. The economic foundations that had sustained the Akkadian Empire were already showing severe strain in the final decades of the dynasty. The extensive trade networks that had brought wealth from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia required constant military protection and administrative oversight. As central authority weakened, local governors increasingly acted independently, diverting tax revenues and trade profits to their own purposes rather than supporting the imperial administration. The irrigation systems that supported agricultural productivity in central Mesopotamia suffered from neglect as resources were diverted to military campaigns against rebellious provinces and external threats. This economic deterioration created conditions particularly favourable to the Gutian expansion strategy. Unlike the Akkadians, who relied heavily on agricultural surpluses from irrigated fields and long-distance trade revenues, the Gutians maintained their traditional pastoral economy supplemented by raiding and tribute extraction. Their reduced dependence on fixed agricultural infrastructure made them far more resilient to the economic disruptions that were crippling the sedentary populations of Mesopotamia. The Gutian military organization had evolved considerably from the tribal raiding parties of earlier centuries into a more sophisticated force capable of sustained territorial conquest. Archaeological evidence from sites in the central Zagros suggests that Gutian communities had begun consolidating under more centralized leadership structures during the late Akkadian period. This consolidation process appears to have been driven partly by the opportunities presented by Mesopotamian weakness, and partly by internal pressures as highland populations grew and competition for resources intensified. The transition from highland warfare to lowland conquest required significant adaptations in Gutian military tactics and equipment. Their traditional fighting methods developed for mountain terrain where mobility and knowledge of local geography provided decisive advantages, needed modification for the open plains and urban environments of Mesopotamia. Gutian forces retained their emphasis on rapid movement and surprise attacks, but they also had to develop capabilities for siege warfare and the occupation of fortified settlements. Evidence from Mesopotamian sites dating to this period shows clear signs of violent destruction followed by cultural changes consistent with Gutian occupation. At Tel Brak, excavations have revealed a destruction layer dated to approximately 2150 BC, followed by architectural modifications and ceramic assemblages that differ markedly from earlier Akkadian period materials. The new pottery styles show clear highland influences, with grey-black burnished wares similar to those found in Zagros sites appearing alongside traditional Mesopotamian forms. The Gutian approach to territorial conquest differed fundamentally from the Akkadian model of imperial administration. Rather than establishing a centralized bureaucratic system with appointed governors and standardized administrative procedures, the Gutians appear to have maintained a more decentralized approach based on tribute relationships and local accommodation. This strategy proved particularly effective in the chaotic conditions following the Akkadian collapse, as it required fewer resources and administrative personnel while still providing the Gutians with access to Mesopotamian wealth. Contemporary sources indicate that Gutian expansion proceeded gradually rather than through massive coordinated campaigns. The process appears to have begun with increased raiding activities targeting vulnerable settlements and trade routes. As Akkadian military responses became less effective, these raids grew bolder and more extensive. Eventually, some Gutian groups established permanent bases in conquered territories, transforming from seasonal raiders into occupying forces. The geographical pattern of Gutian expansion reveals strategic priorities focused on controlling key economic and transportation nodes rather than comprehensive territorial occupation. Northern Mesopotamia, with its closer proximity to the Zagros Mountains and its position along major trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with Anatolia and Iran, became the primary focus of Gutian attention. Cities such as Assur, Nusi, and various settlements in the Diyala River Valley show clear evidence of Gutian presence during this period. Central Mesopotamia also experienced significant Gutian penetration, though the pattern there appears more complex. Major urban centres like Babylon and Sippar show evidence of Gutian influence, but the nature of this presence varied considerably from site to site. Some settlements appear to have been directly occupied by Gutian forces, while others may have maintained nominal independence while paying tribute or accepting Gutian overlordship. The adaptation of Gutian military forces to lowland conditions involved significant changes in both equipment and tactics. Highland warfare had traditionally emphasized individual combat skills, mobility, and the use of terrain advantages. Mesopotamian conquest required the development of formation fighting techniques, siege capabilities, and the ability to control and defend fixed positions. Archaeological evidence suggests that Gutian forces adopted certain Mesopotamian military technologies, particularly in siege warfare, while maintaining their traditional advantages in mobility and guerrilla tactics. Gutian warriors appear to have retained their traditional weapons, while incorporating selected Mesopotamian innovations. Bronze weapons became more common among Gutian forces during this period, reflecting both captured equipment and local production using Mesopotamian techniques. However, the overall military culture remained distinctly Highland in character, with emphasis on personal prowess and tribal loyalty, rather than the more disciplined formations characteristic of Mesopotamian armies. The logistical challenges of maintaining Gutian forces in Mesopotamian territories required creative solutions that drew on both highland traditions and lowland resources. The pastoral economy that had sustained Gutian communities in the mountains could not be simply transplanted to the irrigated plains of Mesopotamia. Instead, Gutian forces appear to have developed hybrid economic strategies that combine traditional pastoralism with tribute extraction and participation in lowland agricultural systems. Evidence from occupied sites suggests that Gutian groups often maintained their herds while also extracting agricultural surpluses from conquered populations. This dual approach provided both food security and economic flexibility, allowing Gutian forces to remain mobile when necessary while still benefiting from the higher productivity of Mesopotamian agriculture. The integration of these different economic systems required considerable organizational sophistication and represents a significant adaptation from traditional highland practices. The Sumerian king list provides the most detailed contemporary account of the Gutian period, though its treatment of these events reflects the perspective of later Mesopotamian scribes rather than neutral historical observation. According to this source, the Gutians ruled for a total of 91 years and 40 days, with 21 different kings listed by name. The list characterizes the Gutian period as one of chaos and barbarism, describing the Gutians as the fanged serpent of the mountains, who carried off the kingship to the mountains. The reliability of the Sumerian king list's chronological information remains a subject of scholarly debate, but the basic framework it provides appears consistent with other evidence for the duration and character of Gutian dominance. The relatively short reigns attributed to individual Gutian rulers suggest a political system quite different from the stable dynasties that characterized both earlier and later Mesopotamian periods. This pattern may reflect the tribal nature of Gutian leadership, where authority was more contested and succession less institutionalized than in traditional Mesopotamian monarchies. Other contemporary sources provide additional perspectives on the Gutian invasion and occupation. The Curse of Akkad, a Sumerian literary composition, attributes the fall of the Akkadian Empire to divine punishment for Naram-Sin's destruction of the Ekur temple in Nippur. While this text focuses primarily on theological explanations for Akkadian decline, it also provides valuable details about the chaos and destruction that followed the empire's collapse. The text describes widespread famine, economic disruption, and the breakdown of trade relationships that created conditions favourable to Gutian expansion. Various lamentations and other literary texts from this period reflect the trauma experienced by Mesopotamian populations during the transition from Akkadian to Gutian rule. These sources consistently portray the Gutians as foreign destroyers who brought chaos and suffering to the civilized world. While such characterizations clearly reflect cultural bias and propaganda purposes, they also provide insights into the real disruptions caused by the change in political control. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, though composed somewhat later, contains references to earlier periods of foreign domination that may reflect memories of the Gutian period. The text describes foreign peoples who know not grain bringing destruction to Mesopotamian cities, a characterization that fits the pastoral background of the Gutians. Such literary sources, while requiring careful interpretation, provide valuable supplementary information about contemporary perceptions of these events. Archaeological evidence from sites across northern and central Mesopotamia corroborates many aspects of the textual sources, while also revealing the complexity of Gutian Mesopotamian interactions. At Nippur, excavations have revealed changes in material culture during the late 3rd millennium BC that suggest foreign influence without complete cultural replacement. New pottery styles appear alongside traditional forms, and architectural modifications show adaptation to different cultural practices, while maintaining basic Mesopotamian urban planning principles. The site of Eshnunna provides particularly clear evidence for the nature of Gutian occupation in central Mesopotamia. Stratigraphic analysis reveals a period of destruction, followed by rebuilding with modified architectural styles and new material culture assemblages. The presence of highland pottery forms and metallurgical traditions indicates direct Gutian presence. while the continuation of certain Mesopotamian practices suggests accommodation between conquerors and conquered populations. Similar patterns appear at numerous other sites throughout the region affected by Gutian expansion. At Tel Asmar, changes in temple architecture and ritual deposits indicate religious modifications that may reflect Gutian influence on local practices. The appearance of new burial customs at several sites suggests demographic changes consistent with the settlement of highland populations in lowland areas. The economic impact of Gutian rule extended far beyond the immediate effects of military conquest. The disruption of established trade networks had cascading effects throughout the region and beyond. Commercial relationships that had connected Mesopotamia with the Indus Valley, Anatolia, and other distant regions were severed or significantly reduced. Local craft production declined as demand for luxury goods diminished and raw materials became scarce. The administrative apparatus that emerged under Gutian rule represented a fundamental departure from the sophisticated bureaucratic systems that had characterized both Sumerian city-states and the Akkadian Empire. Rather than attempting to replicate the complex hierarchical structures they had conquered, the Gutians implemented a governance model that reflected their tribal origins while adapting to the practical necessities of controlling sedentary populations. This hybrid system combined elements of traditional highland leadership with pragmatic accommodations to Mesopotamian administrative practices. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres during the Gutian period reveals a dramatic simplification of record-keeping systems. The vast cuneiform archives that had documented every aspect of Akkadian administration gave way to much smaller collections of tablets, dealing primarily with tribute collection and resource distribution. At sites like Girsu and Umma, the administrative quarters show clear modifications during this period, and many rooms previously used for document storage being converted to other purposes. The standardized cylinder seals that had facilitated Akkadian bureaucratic communication largely disappeared, replaced by simpler stamp seals that reflected Highland traditions. The Gutian approach to local governance relied heavily on existing Mesopotamian administrative personnel, though under significantly altered circumstances. Rather than replacing local officials entirely, Gutian rulers typically retained experienced scribes, tax collectors, and other functionaries while placing them under the supervision of Gutian overseers. This system preserved essential administrative knowledge while ensuring Gutian control over key decisions. Tablets from Puzrish Dagon, a major administrative centre during the Ur-3 period, contain references to earlier practices that suggest continuity of certain bureaucratic procedures from the Gutian period. The territorial organisation under Gutian rule reflected their decentralised political traditions rather than the unified imperial structure of their predecessors. Individual Gutian chieftains appear to have controlled specific regions or cities, maintaining loose confederate relationships with other Gutian leaders rather than serving under a single supreme authority. This fragmented approach to governance created a patchwork of semi-autonomous territories, each with its own administrative practices and tribute obligations. Evidence from contemporary tablets indicates that Gutian administrators focused primarily on extracting agricultural surpluses and controlling trade routes, rather than maintaining the complex urban services that had characterized earlier periods. The elaborate irrigation management systems that had sustained Mesopotamian agriculture received minimal attention from Gutian authorities, who lacked both the technical expertise and institutional commitment necessary for their maintenance. This neglect had cascading effects on agricultural productivity throughout the region. The relationship between Gutian rulers and Mesopotamian urban populations reveals a complex dynamic of accommodation and resistance. Unlike conquerors who sought to impose entirely foreign systems, the Gutians generally allowed local communities to maintain their traditional social structures and daily practices while extracting tribute and asserting ultimate political authority. This approach minimized immediate resistance, but also limited the depth of Gutian integration into Mesopotamian society. Local governance structures at the city level show considerable variation during the Gutian period, reflecting the decentralized nature of Highland political organization. Some cities appear to have maintained traditional councils of elders and civic officials under Gutian oversight, while others experienced more direct military administration. The archaeological record suggests that larger urban centres generally retained more autonomy than smaller settlements, possibly due to their greater economic importance and the practical difficulties of administering complex urban populations. The economic disruption caused by Gutian rule extended far beyond the immediate effects of conquest and tribute extraction. The sophisticated commercial networks that had connected Mesopotamia with distant regions collapsed as political instability made long-distance trade increasingly hazardous and unprofitable. Merchants who had previously maintained regular routes to the Indus Valley, Anatolia, and the Persian Gulf found their activities severely constrained by the fragmented political landscape and the Gutians' limited understanding of commercial practices. Archaeological evidence from major trading centres illustrates the dramatic decline in commercial activity during this period. At Kanesh and Anatolia, the old Assyrian merchant archives contain virtually no references to Mesopotamian trade during the Gutian period, suggesting a complete breakdown of established commercial relationships. Similarly, sites along the Persian Gulf show marked reductions in Mesopotamian imports, indicating the collapse of the maritime trade networks that had brought wealth and exotic goods to the region. The disruption of trade relationships had particularly severe consequences for craft production throughout Mesopotamia. Specialized artisans who had depended on imported raw materials found themselves unable to continue their traditional activities. The production of luxury goods, which had flourished under Akkadian patronage, declined precipitously as both materials and markets disappeared. Archaeological assemblages from this period show a marked reduction in the quality and variety of manufactured goods, with local production increasingly focused on basic necessities rather than sophisticated crafts. The collapse of interregional trade also affected the availability of essential materials for daily life. Metal tools became scarce as supplies of tin and copper were interrupted, forcing many communities to revert to stone and bone implements. The quality of pottery production declined as specialized potters lost access to particular clays and tempering materials that had been imported from distant sources. Even basic agricultural tools became difficult to obtain, contributing to declining productivity in rural areas. Urban economies throughout Mesopotamia contracted significantly under Gutian rule as the complex service sectors that had supported city life became unsustainable. The scribal schools that had trained administrative personnel largely closed as demand for their services diminished. Specialized workshops that had produced goods for export ceased operation when their markets disappeared. The result was a general simplification of economic life that affected all levels of society. The Gutian approach to religious administration reflected their outsider status and limited understanding of Mesopotamian theological traditions. Rather than attempting to integrate themselves into the complex religious hierarchies that had legitimized earlier rulers, Gutian leaders generally adopted a pragmatic approach that allowed existing religious institutions to continue functioning while extracting resources from temple estates. This policy avoided direct confrontation with powerful priesthoods while ensuring that religious wealth contributed to Gutian coffers. Archaeological evidence from major temple complexes reveals significant changes in religious practices during the Gutian period. At Nippur, traditionally considered the religious centre of Mesopotamia, excavations have uncovered modifications to temple architecture that suggest altered ritual practices. Storage areas within the temple complex show evidence of systematic extraction of resources, while certain ceremonial spaces appear to have been converted to more practical uses. The elaborate votive offerings that had characterized earlier periods largely disappear from the archaeological record, replaced by simpler and less costly dedications. The relationship between Gutian rulers and Mesopotamian priesthoods appears to have varied considerably depending on local circumstances and the attitudes of individual leaders. Some temples maintained their traditional functions and privileges under Gutian protection, while others experienced significant interference in their operations. The absence of royal inscriptions commissioning temple construction or restoration projects indicates that Gutian rulers did not adopt the traditional Mesopotamian concept of kingship as divine stewardship of religious institutions. Gutian religious policies seem to have been driven primarily by practical considerations rather than theological convictions. The extraction of wealth from temple estates provided essential resources for maintaining Gutian military forces and administrative apparatus. However, the Gutians appear to have recognized the importance of religious institutions in maintaining social stability and generally avoided actions that might provoke widespread religious opposition. The integration of Highland religious traditions with Mesopotamian practices remains poorly documented due to the limited written sources from this period. However, archaeological evidence suggests some blending of religious customs, particularly in areas with substantial Gutian settlement. Small figurines and ritual objects found in domestic contexts show stylistic influences that may reflect Highland traditions, while certain burial practices appear to have been modified during the Gutian period. The material culture changes documented at archaeological sites throughout Mesopotamia provide the clearest evidence for the nature and extent of Gutian influence during this period. Settlement patterns show significant modifications as Highland populations established themselves in lowland areas, while existing communities adapted to new political and economic realities. The archaeological record reveals a complex process of cultural interaction rather than simple replacement of Mesopotamian traditions by Highland customs. Pottery assemblages from Gutian period sites display distinctive characteristics that reflect the blending of Highland and lowland ceramic traditions. The grey-black burnished wares characteristic of Zagros mountain sites appear alongside traditional Mesopotamian forms, often within the same archaeological contexts. This coexistence suggests household-level interaction between Gutian settlers and local populations, rather than complete segregation of the different ethnic groups. The technical quality of pottery production generally declined during this period, possibly reflecting the disruption of specialized craft traditions and the loss of skilled artisans. Architectural modifications at residential sites indicate changes in domestic organization that may reflect Gutian influence. Traditional Mesopotamian house plans, with their emphasis on central courtyards and formal reception areas, were often modified to include features more characteristic of Highland dwellings. Hearth locations were frequently altered, and storage arrangements show adaptations that may reflect different subsistence strategies. These changes suggest practical accommodations to new residents rather than wholesale abandonment of existing structures. The distribution of settlement sites shows significant changes during the Gutian period, with some areas experiencing population decline, while others saw increased occupation. Northern Mesopotamia, closest to the Zagros Mountains, shows evidence of substantial new settlement that likely reflects Gutian colonization. Central Mesopotamian sites display more variable patterns, with some major centres maintaining their populations while smaller settlements were often abandoned. This selective occupation pattern suggests that Gutian settlement was strategic rather than random, focusing on locations that offered particular advantages for their pastoral economy or administrative needs. Metallurgical evidence from Gutian period sites reveals both continuity and change in technological traditions. Highland metallurgical techniques appear alongside traditional Mesopotamian methods, creating hybrid technological traditions that drew on both cultural backgrounds. The quality of metal production generally declined during this period, possibly due to the disruption of established supply networks and the loss of specialized knowledge. However, Certain innovations in metalworking may reflect the introduction of Highland techniques that were better adapted to local resource availability. The fortification patterns at sites occupied during the Gutian period show modifications that reflect Highland military traditions. Defensive walls were often rebuilt or strengthened, with architectural features that suggest familiarity with mountain warfare techniques. Gate structures were frequently modified to create more defensible entrances, while watchtowers and other military installations show design elements characteristic of Highland fortifications. These modifications indicate that Gutian settlers remained concerned about security even after establishing control over their territories. Burial practices during the Gutian period display significant variations that may reflect the interaction between different cultural traditions. Some cemeteries show continuity with earlier Mesopotamian practices, while others display innovations that could reflect Highland customs. The appearance of new grave goods and altered burial orientations at several sites suggests changes in religious or cultural beliefs. However, the limited preservation of organic materials makes it difficult to fully reconstruct the burial practices of this period. The evidence for craft specialization during the Gutian period indicates a general decline in the sophisticated production systems that had characterized earlier periods. The workshops that had produced luxury goods for elite consumption largely disappeared, replaced by more generalized production focused on basic necessities. This simplification of craft traditions had long-term consequences for Mesopotamian material culture, as specialized knowledge and techniques were lost during the period of disruption. The fragmented nature of Gutian political authority becomes most apparent when examining the individual rulers who governed during their century-long dominance over Mesopotamia. Unlike the well-documented reigns of Akkadian monarchs or later Mesopotamian dynasties, Gutian kingship presents a complex puzzle of overlapping authorities, regional variations and succession patterns that defied the centralized models familiar to lowland civilizations. The cuneiform records that preserve the names and deeds of Gutian rulers reveal a political system that maintained Highland tribal characteristics while adapting to the administrative demands of governing sedentary populations. Eridupesir stands as perhaps the most prominent Gutian ruler documented in contemporary sources, his name appearing on numerous tablets from sites across northern Mesopotamia. Administrative texts from Nutsi and Tel Brak indicate that Eridupesir controlled territories extending from the Diyala River Valley to the upper reaches of the Tigris, suggesting a degree of territorial consolidation unusual for Gutian political organization. His reign appears to have lasted approximately 7 years based on dated economic tablets, during which time he implemented administrative reforms that attempted to systematize tribute collection while maintaining local governance structures. The tablets bearing Eridupesir's name reveal sophisticated understanding of Mesopotamian administrative practices, indicating either personal familiarity with lowland bureaucratic systems or reliance on experienced Mesopotamian advisors. Economic records from his reign show standardized measures and systematic record-keeping that contrast sharply with the ad hoc administrative practices typical of earlier Gutian rulers. Land tenure documents suggest that Eridupesir attempted to formalize property relationships in conquered territories, possibly to facilitate more efficient tribute extraction or to accommodate Gutian settlers seeking permanent agricultural holdings. Eridupesir's military activities, as documented in fragmentary royal inscriptions, focus primarily on consolidating control over trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Iranian plateau. His forces appear to have established permanent garrisons at strategic locations along these routes, marking a departure from the mobile raiding strategies that had characterized earlier Gutian military operations. Archaeological evidence from sites attributed to his reign shows substantial fortification projects, including the construction of new defensive walls and the modification of existing urban fortifications to accommodate Highland military techniques. The political organisation under Eridu-Pizir reveals attempts to balance traditional Gutian tribal structures with the administrative requirements of territorial governance. Tablets from administrative centres indicate the establishment of a hierarchy of officials that combined Gutian military commanders with retained Mesopotamian bureaucrats. This dual system created tensions that appear in contemporary records as disputes over authority and jurisdiction, suggesting that the integration of different administrative traditions remained incomplete throughout his reign. Imta, whose reign followed Eridu-Pizir according to the chronological evidence from dated tablets, represents a different approach to Gutian kingship that emphasized accommodation with existing Mesopotamian institutions rather than systematic reform. His name appears frequently in temple records from Nippur and Babylon, indicating active engagement with religious establishments that had maintained distance from earlier Gutian rulers. Economic tablets suggest that Imta reduced tribute demands on certain temple estates, while requiring religious institutions to provide military support for his campaigns. The territorial extent of Imta's authority appears more limited than that of his predecessor, with evidence for his rule concentrated in central Mesopotamia rather than the broader regional control exercised by Eridu-Pizir. This geographic restriction may reflect the fragmentation of Gutian authority following Eridu-Pizir's death, or conscious policy decisions to focus administrative resources on more manageable territories. Archaeological evidence from sites dated to Imta's reign shows continued occupation of major urban centres, but abandonment of several smaller settlements, suggesting population consolidation under his rule. Imta's relationship with local Mesopotamian elites reveals sophisticated diplomatic skills that enabled him to maintain control with reduced military presence. Tablets from private archives indicate that he confirmed traditional property rights and commercial privileges for established merchant families, creating stakeholder relationships that provided stability without requiring extensive administrative oversight. This approach appears to have been particularly successful in maintaining urban populations that might otherwise have fled to regions beyond Gutian control. The military organisation under Imta shows significant modifications from earlier Gutian practices, with greater emphasis on defensive strategies rather than territorial expansion. Fortification projects from his reign focus on strengthening existing defences rather than establishing new military installations, suggesting a shift toward consolidation rather than conquest. The integration of Mesopotamian military personnel into Gutian forces appears to have accelerated during his reign, creating hybrid military units that combined highland mobility with lowland siege capabilities. Inkishush, documented in tablets from the later portion of the Gutian period, governed during a time of increasing pressure from resurgent Sumerian city-states in southern Mesopotamia. His reign coincided with the early phases of the Ur-III revival, requiring defensive strategies against increasingly sophisticated opposition forces. Administrative records from his reign show emergency mobilization measures and resource concentration that indicate the challenges facing Gutian authority during this period. The territorial control exercised by Inkishush appears to have been primarily concentrated in northern Mesopotamia, with southern territories increasingly contested by Sumerian forces. Economic tablets from sites under his control show systematic extraction of resources for military purposes, including conscription of local populations for construction projects and military service. The administrative apparatus during his reign displays characteristics of a state under siege, with simplified procedures focused on immediate military needs rather than long-term governance. Inkishush's relationship with subordinate Gutian commanders reveals increasing centralization of authority as external pressures mounted. Tablets from regional administrative centres show direct royal intervention in local affairs that had previously been left to regional governors. This centralization represented a significant departure from traditional Gutian political organization and may have contributed to internal tensions that weakened resistance to Sumerian resurgence. The military innovations documented during Inkishush's reign include adoption of Mesopotamian siege techniques and fortification designs that reflected lessons learned from conflicts with Sumerian forces. Archaeological evidence from defensive installations shows sophisticated engineering that combined highland knowledge of terrain utilization with lowland expertise in construction techniques. These defensive preparations proved insufficient to prevent the eventual Sumerian reconquest, but demonstrate the adaptive capabilities of Gutian military organization. Sarlagab, among the final Gutian rulers documented in contemporary sources, governed during the terminal phase of highland dominance as Sumerian forces under Utu-Hagiel of Uruk mounted successful campaigns to expel Gutian forces from Mesopotamia. His reign provides crucial insights into the collapse of Gutian political authority and the factors that contributed to their eventual defeat. Administrative tablets from his brief rule show increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control over diminishing territories. The fragmentation of Gutian authority under Sarlagab appears in contemporary records as competing claims to kingship among different highland commanders. Economic tablets from various sites show conflicting administrative orders and disputed tribute obligations, indicating breakdown of centralized authority. This political fragmentation facilitated Sumerian military success by preventing coordinated Gutian resistance to reconquest campaigns. Sarlagab's military responses to Sumerian advances reveal both the strengths and limitations of Gutian political organization. Highland forces retained their traditional advantages in mobility and guerrilla warfare, enabling them to conduct effective harassing campaigns against Sumerian supply lines. However, the inability to coordinate defensive strategies among different Gutian commanders prevented effective resistance to sustained Sumerian pressure. The succession patterns among Gutian rulers reveal political structures that combined hereditary elements with elective or competitive selection processes characteristic of tribal societies. Evidence from administrative tablets suggests that leadership succession was contested rather than automatic, with different claimants requiring recognition from subordinate commanders and allied tribal groups. This system provided flexibility in leadership selection, but also created instability during succession crises. The relationship between individual Gutian rulers and the broader tribal confederation that supported their authority shows considerable variation throughout the period of Mesopotamian dominance. Some rulers appear to have maintained close ties with highland tribal groups, regularly consulting with traditional councils and incorporating tribal representatives into their administrative apparatus. Others adopted more autocratic approaches that distanced them from traditional support networks while attempting to create new bases of authority among conquered populations. Regional variations in Gutian political control reflect both practical administrative constraints and deliberate policy choices that recognize the diversity of territories under Highland rule. Northern Mesopotamian regions with substantial Gutian settlement experienced more direct administration, while central Mesopotamian territories often retained greater autonomy under tributary relationships. Southern regions that remained contested throughout the Gutian period show evidence of military administration focused primarily on resource extraction rather than stable governance. The degree of autonomy maintained by local Mesopotamian governors varied significantly depending on their strategic importance, economic productivity, and willingness to cooperate with Gutian authorities. Major urban centres with complex administrative requirements often retained experienced local officials under Gutian oversight, while smaller settlements might be placed under direct military administration. This flexible approach enabled Gutian rulers to maintain control with limited administrative personnel, while adapting to local conditions. Diplomatic relations with neighbouring powers reveal sophisticated understanding of regional political dynamics among Gutian rulers despite their highland origins. Contemporary tablets document diplomatic correspondence with Elamite rulers that established territorial boundaries and trade agreements, indicating recognition of Gutian authority by major regional powers. These diplomatic relationships provided legitimacy for Gutian rule while creating alliances that supported their position against potential challengers. The relationship between Gutian rulers and surviving Sumerian city-states in southern Mesopotamia evolved from initial accommodation to increasing hostility as Sumerian political revival gained momentum. Early Gutian rulers appear to have maintained tributary relationships with southern cities, allowing them considerable autonomy in exchange for regular tribute payments. As Sumerian confidence grew and military capabilities improved, these relationships became increasingly strained, ultimately leading to open warfare. Gutian diplomatic strategies with Elamite powers focused primarily on securing eastern borders while maintaining access to highland territories that remained essential for recruiting military personnel and maintaining tribal alliances. Treaties documented in contemporary tablets established mutual recognition of territorial boundaries and provided for cooperation against common enemies, particularly resurgent Mesopotamian city-states. These diplomatic relationships demonstrate the international recognition accorded to Gutian political authority during their period of dominance. The administrative correspondence between Gutian rulers and subordinate governors reveals sophisticated communication networks that maintained political cohesion across extensive territories. Messenger systems connected highland strongholds with lowland administrative centres, enabling coordination of policy and rapid response to local crises. The preservation of these communication networks required substantial investment in personnel and infrastructure that demonstrates the organizational capabilities of Gutian political leadership. The evolution of Gutian political organization throughout their century of Mesopotamian dominance shows gradual adaptation to the requirements of territorial governance while maintaining essential elements of highland tribal structure. Early rulers relied heavily on traditional tribal councils and informal consensus building, while later monarchs developed more centralized administrative systems that resembled conventional Mesopotamian kingship. This evolutionary process reflects both practical necessities and the influence of Mesopotamian political traditions on highland rulers. The social fabric that emerged during the Gutian period represented a complex amalgamation of highland tribal traditions and established Mesopotamian hierarchical structures, creating unique patterns of stratification that differed markedly from both preceding Akkadian imperial organization and the city-state systems that would follow. Archaeological evidence from residential quarters in major centres like Nippur, Babylon, and Eshnunna reveals how Gutian elites integrated themselves into existing aristocratic networks while maintaining distinct cultural identities that reflected their mountain origins. Gutian nobility established themselves primarily through military achievement and control over tribute collection, rather than through the traditional Mesopotamian routes of temple service or administrative expertise. Excavations at Tel Asmar have uncovered residential complexes from this period that show clear adaptations of traditional Mesopotamian elite architecture to accommodate highland customs and social practices. These compounds typically featured central courtyards modified with raised platforms and fire installations characteristic of Zagros mountain domestic architecture, while retaining the formal reception halls and storage facilities essential for maintaining status within Mesopotamian urban society. The integration process between Gutian and Mesopotamian elites appears to have involved strategic marriage alliances and adoption of local customs, rather than wholesale replacement of existing social structures. Tablets from private archives at Kanesh and Nutsi document property transfers and business partnerships between highland nobles and established merchant families, indicating economic collaboration that transcended ethnic boundaries. These relationships created hybrid elite networks that combined Gutian military authority with Mesopotamian commercial expertise and local knowledge. Gutian aristocrats adopted certain Mesopotamian status markers, while maintaining distinctive highland elements in their material culture. Burial assemblages from elite cemeteries dating to this period show combinations of traditional Mesopotamian luxury goods, cylinder seals, precious metal jewellery, imported textiles, alongside distinctly highland artefacts such as bronze horse bits, distinctive pottery forms, and weapons that reflect mountain warfare traditions. The presence of both cultural traditions within single burial contexts suggests that Gutian elites successfully navigated between their highland heritage and their adopted Mesopotamian social environment. The relationship between Gutian military commanders and traditional Mesopotamian priesthoods created particularly complex social dynamics that required careful negotiation of competing authority claims. Temple records from Nippur indicate that certain Gutian nobles obtained ceremonial positions within religious hierarchies, though they rarely achieved the highest ranks traditionally reserved for individuals with extensive theological training. This religious participation provided legitimacy within Mesopotamian society, while allowing Gutian elites to maintain their distinct cultural identity. Lower levels of Gutian society show different patterns of integration that reflected their more limited resources and different social objectives. Archaeological evidence from residential areas in cities like Sippar and Babylon reveals Gutian households that adopted Mesopotamian architectural forms while maintaining highland domestic practices. Cooking installations, storage arrangements, and workshop areas show modifications that accommodated pastoral products and highland craft traditions within urban environments designed for sedentary populations. The artisan classes during the Gutian period experienced significant disruption as traditional craft specializations became less viable due to reduced demand for luxury goods and interrupted supply networks for raw materials. However, new opportunities emerged as Gutian populations required products that reflected their cultural preferences and practical needs. Metalworkers adapted their techniques to produce Highland-style weapons and tools, while potters developed hybrid ceramic traditions that combined Mesopotamian technical expertise with Highland aesthetic preferences. Mesopotamian urban populations under Gutian rule generally maintained their traditional social organization, while adapting to new political realities and economic constraints. The merchant classes that had prospered under Akkadian imperial trade networks faced particular challenges as commercial relationships were disrupted, but some families successfully redirected their activities towards serving Gutian administrative needs and facilitating Highland-Lowland economic exchange. Administrative tablets from Pusrish Degan document Mesopotamian merchants who specialized in supplying Highland products to urban markets and Mesopotamian goods to Gutian settlements. Agricultural communities experienced the most dramatic changes in social organization as Gutian pastoral traditions encountered established Mesopotamian farming systems. The integration of these different subsistence strategies required significant modifications to traditional land tenure arrangements and agricultural labor organization. Evidence from rural settlements in the Diyala River Valley shows the establishment of mixed agricultural pastoral communities where Mesopotamian farmers worked alongside Gutian herders to develop integrated production systems that maximize the productivity of both crops and livestock. The transformation of agricultural practices under Gutian influence reflected both practical adaptations to Highland pastoral traditions and the administrative priorities of the new rulers. Traditional Mesopotamian agriculture had depended heavily on intensive irrigation systems that required constant maintenance and sophisticated coordination among numerous small-scale cultivators. The Gutian emphasis on pastoral production and their limited understanding of hydraulic engineering led to significant modifications in both agricultural techniques and land use patterns. Irrigation management during the Gutian period shows clear evidence of declining maintenance standards and reduced coordination among different agricultural communities. Archaeological surveys in the Mesopotamian heartland reveal canal systems that were partially abandoned or simplified during this period, with complex distribution networks replaced by more basic water management systems that required less technical expertise to maintain. The reduction in irrigation infrastructure had cascading effects on agricultural productivity, forcing farmers to adapt their cultivation practices to less reliable water supplies. The integration of pastoral activities into traditional agricultural areas created new land use patterns that combined crop production with animal husbandry in ways that had been uncommon in earlier Mesopotamian practice. Field systems from this period show evidence of modified cultivation techniques that accommodated grazing animals while maintaining crop production. Barley cultivation, which had always been important in Mesopotamian agriculture, became even more dominant during the Gutian period due to its suitability for areas with reduced irrigation and its value as animal feed. Crop production strategies during the Gutian period emphasized hardy varieties that could survive with reduced water inputs and less intensive cultivation practices. Archaeological evidence from storage facilities indicates increased reliance on drought-resistant barley varieties and reduced cultivation of water-intensive crops like wheat. The overall agricultural productivity appears to have declined during this period, though the integration of pastoral products may have compensated for reduced crop yields in terms of overall food security. Land tenure arrangements underwent significant modifications as Gutian authorities attempted to accommodate both their pastoral traditions and the established agricultural systems of conquered territories. Administrative tablets from this period document new forms of property relationships that combined individual ownership of specific plots with communal grazing rights over broader areas. These hybrid tenure systems created complex legal relationships that required ongoing negotiation between different user groups. The establishment of Gutian pastoral settlements within traditional agricultural areas created competition for land and water resources that required new forms of conflict resolution and resource sharing. Evidence from legal documents indicates the development of arbitration systems that drew on both highland tribal traditions and Mesopotamian legal precedents to resolve disputes between farmers and herders. These hybrid legal systems demonstrate the practical adaptations required to maintain social stability during the period of cultural integration. Agricultural labour organisation during the Gutian period shows modifications that reflected both the reduced availability of coordinated labour for intensive cultivation and the integration of pastoral work into traditional farming communities. The large-scale labour mobilisation that had characterised Akkadian agricultural projects became less common, replaced by more decentralised work arrangements that emphasised household-level production and local cooperation. This shift towards smaller-scale agriculture may have reduced overall productivity, but created more resilient local food systems. Urban planning during the Gutian period reveals a pragmatic approach to city management that focused on maintaining essential functions while adapting to reduced resources and different cultural priorities. Major cities like Babylon and Nippur show evidence of continued occupation and basic maintenance, but with significant modifications to accommodate Gutian administrative needs and settlement patterns. The monumental construction projects that had characterized earlier periods largely ceased, replaced by more modest modifications and repairs to existing infrastructure. Defensive architecture received particular attention during the Gutian period as military considerations became paramount in urban planning decisions. City walls were strengthened and modified to incorporate Highland fortress design elements, while gate complexes were rebuilt to create more defensible entrances. Archaeological evidence from sites like Eshnunna shows the construction of new watchtowers and the modification of existing structures to improve defensive capabilities, reflecting the ongoing military challenges faced by Gutian authorities. Residential architecture in Gutian-controlled cities shows adaptive modifications that accommodated Highland domestic practices within traditional Mesopotamian urban layouts. House plans were often modified to include features like central hearths and specialized storage areas for pastoral products, while maintaining the basic courtyard organization that characterized Mesopotamian domestic architecture. These modifications demonstrate successful cultural adaptation that preserved essential elements of both traditions. Public architecture during the Gutian period focused primarily on administrative and military functions, rather than the ceremonial and religious construction that had characterized earlier periods. Palace complexes were modified to serve as military headquarters and administrative centers, with traditional throne rooms converted to practical meeting spaces and residential quarters expanded to accommodate Highland-style household organization. The absence of major temple construction projects reflects both reduced resources and the Gutians' limited engagement with traditional Mesopotamian religious architecture. Infrastructure maintenance during the Gutian period shows selective attention to systems that were essential for maintaining urban populations while allowing less critical facilities to deteriorate. Water supply systems generally received adequate maintenance to ensure basic urban needs were met, but the elaborate distribution networks that had served decorative fountains and luxury facilities were often simplified or abandoned. Street maintenance focused on major thoroughfares while secondary roads were allowed to deteriorate, creating a tiered system of urban infrastructure that reflected resource constraints. The construction projects undertaken during the Gutian period were generally smaller in scale and more utilitarian in purpose than the monumental works of earlier periods. Archaeological evidence shows numerous small-scale building projects focused on practical needs like storage facilities, workshops and residential quarters for Gutian settlers. The technical quality of construction generally declined during this period, though some projects show innovative combinations of highland and lowland building techniques. Religious syncretism during the Gutian period created complex theological landscapes that combined Mesopotamian divine pantheons with highland spiritual traditions in ways that satisfied both conquered populations and Gutian rulers. The process of religious integration proceeded gradually and varied significantly among different regions and communities, reflecting local conditions and the attitudes of individual Gutian commanders toward traditional Mesopotamian religious practices. Gutian rulers generally adopted formal relationships with major Mesopotamian deities while maintaining private devotion to highland spiritual traditions that remained largely invisible in official records. Royal inscriptions from this period show Gutian kings invoking traditional Mesopotamian gods like Enlil and Marduk, in contexts that suggest genuine religious devotion rather than mere political expedience. However, archaeological evidence from residential areas associated with Gutian elites reveals continued use of highland religious artifacts and ritual practices that were not integrated into official religious observances. The adoption of Mesopotamian religious practices by Gutian populations appears to have been selective and pragmatic, focusing on deities and rituals that complemented rather than contradicted highland spiritual traditions. Mountain-dwelling peoples had long venerated natural features like peaks, springs, and caves, and these traditions found accommodation within Mesopotamian religious systems that also recognized the sacred character of natural phenomena. The integration process created hybrid religious practices that satisfied both cultural traditions while maintaining distinct identity markers for different ethnic groups. Temple administration during the Gutian period shows modifications that reflected both practical administrative needs and religious accommodation between different traditions. Gutian authorities generally maintained existing temple hierarchies while introducing highland religious personnel into lower-level positions within religious establishments. This integration created opportunities for cultural exchange while preserving the specialized knowledge required for maintaining traditional Mesopotamian religious practices. Highland religious traditions that emphasized portable, sacred objects and flexible ritual practices adapted more easily to Mesopotamian urban environments than did the elaborate temple-based ceremonies that characterized lowland religious life. Archaeological evidence from domestic contexts shows the continued use of small religious figurines and ritual objects that reflected highland traditions, suggesting that private religious practices maintained greater cultural distinctiveness than did public religious observances. The theological implications of religious syncretism during the Gutian period created intellectual challenges that required creative solutions from religious authorities in both traditions. Highland spiritual concepts that emphasized the sacredness of natural landscapes had to be reconciled with Mesopotamian theological systems that focused on urban temple complexes and elaborate ritual hierarchies. The resolution of these theological tensions appears to have involved the development of new interpretive frameworks that emphasized the universal character of divine authority while maintaining respect for different cultural approaches to religious practice. The religious syncretism that had emerged under Gutian rule contained within it the seeds of organized resistance as Mesopotamian temple complexes gradually transformed from centers of theological accommodation into focal points for coordinated opposition to Highland authority. The priestly hierarchies that had initially cooperated with Gutian administrators began exploiting their unique position within Mesopotamian society to preserve not only religious traditions, but also the political and cultural frameworks that had sustained lowland civilization for millennia. The Temple of Enlil at Nippur emerged as perhaps the most significant centre of anti-Gutian sentiment during the middle decades of Highland rule. Archaeological evidence from the sacred precinct reveals systematic concealment of valuable religious artefacts and administrative records during this period, suggesting organised efforts to preserve Mesopotamian cultural heritage from potential Gutian interference. Cuneiform tablets discovered in hidden caches within the temple complex document correspondence between Nippur priests and religious authorities in other cities, creating networks of communication that operated independently of Gutian administrative oversight. The preservation activities undertaken by Mesopotamian religious institutions extended far beyond simple protection of physical artifacts to encompass the maintenance of intellectual traditions that form the foundation of lowland civilization. Scribal schools attached to major temples continued operating throughout the Gutian period, though often in reduced circumstances and with modified curricula that emphasized preservation of existing knowledge rather than innovation or expansion. These educational institutions became repositories for Sumerian literary traditions, mathematical knowledge, and legal precedents that would prove crucial for the eventual restoration of Mesopotamian political authority. Temple workshops during this period focused increasingly on producing items that served both religious and political functions, creating material symbols of Mesopotamian identity that reinforced cultural solidarity among populations under foreign rule. Cylinder seals bearing traditional Mesopotamian iconography continued to be manufactured in temple workshops, even when their official administrative functions had been largely superseded by Gutian stamp seals. These objects served as tangible connections to pre-Gutian political traditions and provided means for expressing cultural allegiance without direct confrontation with Highland authorities. The economic resources controlled by Mesopotamian temples provided essential material support for resistance activities while maintaining the appearance of routine religious administration. Temple estates that had been granted relative autonomy under Gutian rule generated surpluses that could be redirected towards supporting opposition activities without attracting administrative attention. Grain stores maintained for religious festivals provided food supplies for clandestine meetings, while temple workshops produced weapons and equipment under the guise of manufacturing ritual implements. Religious festivals and ceremonial gatherings created opportunities for coordination among resistance groups while maintaining plausible explanations for large assemblies that might otherwise attract Gutian suspicion. The seasonal agricultural celebrations that had long been central to Mesopotamian religious life provided cover for meetings between representatives from different cities and regions. Archaeological evidence from temple complexes shows modifications to ceremonial spaces during this period that may have facilitated covert political activities alongside traditional religious observances. The city-state of Lagash under the leadership of Gudea represents the most successful example of sustained resistance to Gutian authority through a combination of diplomatic accommodation and covert opposition activities. Unlike rulers who chose direct military confrontation with Highland forces, Gudea pursued a sophisticated strategy that maintained nominal submission to Gutian overlords while systematically strengthening Lagash's military capabilities and expanding its territorial influence throughout southern Mesopotamia. Gudea's building projects, documented extensively in contemporary inscriptions and archaeological remains, served multiple purposes that extended far beyond their apparent religious and civic functions. The construction of temples, palaces, and defensive works provided employment for displaced populations, while creating infrastructure that could support military operations when circumstances permitted open resistance. The elaborate temple complex dedicated to Ningirsu required massive resource mobilization that demonstrated Lagash's economic vitality, while training workers in construction techniques applicable to military engineering. The diplomatic correspondence preserved in Gudea's archives reveals sophisticated intelligence networks that monitored Gutian military movements and political developments throughout Mesopotamia. Lagash maintained trade relationships with regions beyond Gutian control, creating channels for obtaining military supplies and coordinating with other resistance centers. The commercial activities that sustained these relationships provided cover for political communications while generating resources essential for military preparations. Gudea's military preparations proceeded gradually and discreetly, avoiding the large-scale mobilizations that might have provoked Gutian intervention, while systematically improving Lagash's defensive capabilities. Archaeological evidence from the city's fortifications shows continuous modification and strengthening throughout Gudea's reign, with defensive walls rebuilt to incorporate lessons learned from observing Gutian siege techniques. Weapon production increased substantially during this period, though much of the output was concealed in underground storage facilities or distributed to allied communities for safekeeping. The territorial expansion achieved by Lagash under Gudea's leadership occurred through careful exploitation of Gutian political fragmentation rather than direct military conquest. As Highland authority became increasingly decentralized during the later phases of their rule, Gudea systematically extended Lagash's influence over neighbouring communities through a combination of economic incentives, military protection, and shared opposition to foreign domination. This expansion created a network of allied cities that could coordinate resistance activities while maintaining individual autonomy. The agricultural policies implemented by Gudea provided both economic foundation for resistance activities and practical training for potential military campaigns. The restoration and expansion of irrigation systems throughout Lagash's territory required large-scale coordination and engineering expertise that could be readily adapted to military logistics. The agricultural surpluses generated by these improved systems provided food security for extended military operations, while demonstrating the advantages of Mesopotamian administration over Gutian rule. Economic warfare emerged as a particularly effective form of resistance that exploited Gutian dependence on Mesopotamian agricultural and craft production, while minimizing the risks associated with direct military confrontation. Mesopotamian communities developed sophisticated strategies for reducing the economic benefits that Gutian authorities derived from their territorial control without engaging in activities that would clearly constitute rebellion and invite military retaliation. Trade boycotts represented one of the most widespread forms of economic resistance, as Mesopotamian merchants and craft producers systematically reduced their interactions with Gutian authorities and settlers. Archaeological evidence from commercial centres shows declining quantities of highland products in Mesopotamian markets during the later phases of Gutian rule, suggesting coordinated efforts to limit economic exchange with the occupying forces. Simultaneously, evidence for increased trade with regions beyond Gutian control indicates deliberate redirection of commercial activities away from highland-dominated territories. The manipulation of tribute collection systems provided another avenue for economic resistance that required sophisticated coordination among different communities and social groups. Mesopotamian administrators who had been retained in Gutian service used their positions to implement subtle forms of sabotage that reduced the efficiency of resource extraction without creating obvious evidence of deliberate obstruction. Tax assessments were delayed or miscalculated, storage facilities suffered mysterious losses, and transportation arrangements experienced frequent disruptions that cumulatively reduced the resources available to Gutian authorities. Craft production during the later Gutian period shows clear evidence of coordinated efforts to limit the availability of high-quality goods to highland elites while maintaining production for Mesopotamian consumption. Metalworkers, textile producers, and other specialized artisans developed distribution networks that prioritized Mesopotamian customers while providing inferior products to Gutian buyers. This selective quality control weakened Gutian military capabilities while strengthening Mesopotamian resistance preparations. Agricultural communities participated in economic resistance through coordinated reductions in crop yields and strategic management of surplus production. Farmers employed traditional techniques for concealing agricultural output from tax assessors while maintaining adequate food supplies for local consumption. Irrigation maintenance was systematically neglected in areas under direct Gutian administration while receiving priority attention in territories controlled by Mesopotamian rulers like Gudea, creating productivity differentials that undermined highland economic control. The coordination required for effective economic warfare necessitated communication networks that operated independently of Gutian administrative oversight. Merchant associations that had facilitated commercial activities under earlier political systems were adapted to serve resistance coordination functions, using established trade routes and commercial relationships to transmit information and coordinate activities across extensive territories. Religious pilgrimages and festival gatherings provided additional opportunities for resistance coordination, while maintaining plausible explanations for inter-regional travel and communication. Military resistance to Gutian rule evolved from sporadic raiding and harassment to increasingly sophisticated campaigns that exploited highland vulnerabilities while avoiding direct confrontation with superior Gutian forces. Mesopotamian military leaders studied Gutian tactical methods and organizational structures, developing countermeasures that neutralized traditional highland advantages while exploiting their limited understanding of lowland warfare conditions. Fortification strategies employed by Mesopotamian resistance forces reflected careful analysis of Gutian military capabilities and tactical preferences. Traditional Mesopotamian defensive architecture was modified to incorporate features that negated highland siege techniques, while creating advantages for defending forces familiar with local terrain and conditions. Archaeological evidence from sites that experienced conflict during this period shows innovative defensive designs that combine traditional lowland engineering with tactical insights gained from observing Gutian military operations. The development of guerrilla warfare techniques by Mesopotamian forces represented a significant adaptation from traditional lowland military practices that had emphasized formal battle formations and siege warfare. Resistance fighters learned to exploit their knowledge of local geography and urban environments to conduct harassment campaigns that disrupted Gutian communications and supply lines without requiring the large-scale military resources necessary for conventional warfare. These tactics proved particularly effective in urban environments where Mesopotamian fighters possessed advantages in local knowledge and population support. Intelligence gathering became a crucial component of Mesopotamian military resistance, as local commanders recognized the importance of understanding Gutian military organization, deployment patterns, and strategic priorities. Networks of informants were established within Gutian administrative and military hierarchies, often utilizing Mesopotamians who had been retained in Highland service. The information obtained through these networks enabled resistance forces to anticipate Gutian military movements and concentrate their limited resources for maximum tactical advantage. Coordination between different resistance centers required sophisticated communication systems that could operate despite Gutian efforts to monitor and control inter-regional contacts. Military commanders developed coded communication methods that utilize commercial correspondence and religious messages to coordinate tactical operations and strategic planning. Archaeological evidence from this period includes examples of apparently routine administrative tablets that contain hidden military intelligence when properly interpreted. The logistical challenges of sustaining military resistance required creative solutions that drew upon both traditional Mesopotamian organizational capabilities and innovations developed specifically for clandestine operations. Weapon production and storage had to be concealed from Gutian authorities while remaining accessible for military operations. Food supplies for resistance fighters required careful management to avoid creating shortages that might attract administrative attention. Medical care for wounded fighters necessitated discreet arrangements that utilized traditional healing practices while maintaining operational security. Training programs for resistance fighters had to balance the need for military effectiveness with requirements for secrecy and security. Military instruction often occurred under cover of traditional activities like religious ceremonies, craft workshops, or agricultural work. Archaeological evidence suggests that some temple complexes were modified to include training facilities that could serve both religious and military functions without attracting Gutian suspicion. The recruitment of personnel for military resistance drew upon various segments of Mesopotamian society, each contributing different capabilities and resources to the overall effort. Former soldiers from Akkadian military units provided professional military expertise and training for civilian volunteers. Craft workers contributed technical skills essential for weapon production and fortification construction. Merchants and traders provided intelligence, communications, and logistical support that enabled resistance operations across extensive territories. Weapons procurement for resistance forces required sophisticated networks that could obtain military equipment without alerting Gutian authorities to the scale of military preparations. Traditional metalworking facilities were adapted for weapon production, often operating under cover of manufacturing agricultural tools or religious implements. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites dating to this period shows hidden weapon caches and concealed production facilities that enabled substantial military preparations while maintaining operational security. The tactical evolution of Mesopotamian resistance forces reflects gradual adaptation to the realities of asymmetric warfare against superior Gutian military capabilities. Early resistance efforts often involved direct confrontation that played to Gutian strengths in mobile warfare and individual combat skills. Later operations emphasized tactics that exploited Mesopotamian advantages in local knowledge, population support, and logistical organization while avoiding the types of engagements where Gutian forces held decisive advantages. Siege warfare techniques developed by resistance forces had to account for limited resources and the need to achieve rapid success before Gutian reinforcements could arrive. Traditional Mesopotamian siege methods were modified to emphasize speed and surprise rather than the prolonged operations that had characterized earlier lowland military practice. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites shows innovative siege equipment and techniques that maximized effectiveness while minimizing resource requirements and operational duration. The emergence of Utu-Hegel as a significant political force in southern Mesopotamia occurred against the backdrop of systematic Mesopotamian resistance that had gradually weakened Gutian control throughout the region. Archaeological evidence from Uruk during the early 22nd century BC reveals intensive military preparations and territorial consolidation that transformed the ancient city from a regional centre into the launching point for the most successful anti-Gutian campaign in Mesopotamian history. The administrative tablets from this period document massive resource mobilization efforts that drew upon both Uruk's traditional economic base and the extensive network of allied communities that had developed during the decades of highland occupation. Utu-Hegel's early political career demonstrates sophisticated understanding of both military strategy and diplomatic coordination that enabled him to succeed where previous resistance efforts had failed. Unlike earlier Mesopotamian leaders who had focused primarily on defending their individual territories, Utu-Hegel recognized that effective opposition to Gutian rule required coordinated action across multiple city-states and regions. His initial consolidation of power within Uruk involved systematic elimination of pro-Gutian elements, while simultaneously building alliances with other resistance centres throughout southern Mesopotamia. The military reforms implemented by Utu-Hegel during his rise to power reflected careful analysis of Gutian tactical methods and strategic vulnerabilities. Traditional Mesopotamian military organisation had emphasised individual city-state armies that operated independently and often competed with each other for territorial advantage. Utu-Hegel's innovations created unified command structures that could coordinate operations across extensive territories while maintaining the flexibility necessary for effective campaign management. Archaeological evidence from weapon production centres associated with Uruk shows standardization of equipment and training methods that enable different military units to operate as integrated forces rather than independent contingents. The territorial expansion achieved by Utu-Hegel during the preparatory phases of his anti-Gutian campaign proceeded through systematic exploitation of highland political fragmentation and declining administrative effectiveness. As Gutian authority became increasingly decentralized during the final decades of their rule, individual highland commanders often found themselves isolated and unable to coordinate defensive measures against coordinated Mesopotamian attacks. Utu-Hegel's forces systematically reduced Gutian strongholds throughout southern Mesopotamia, creating secure base areas for larger military operations, while demonstrating the viability of organised resistance to highland rule. The logistical preparations for Utu-Hegel's decisive campaign against the Gutians required unprecedented coordination among Mesopotamian communities that had maintained relative independence throughout the period of highland occupation. Supply networks were established to support extended military operations far from traditional base areas, while communication systems enabled rapid coordination of tactical movements across extensive territories. The scale of these preparations indicates sophisticated organizational capabilities that drew upon traditional Mesopotamian administrative expertise while incorporating innovations developed during decades of resistance activities. Intelligence gathering operations conducted by Utu-Hegel's forces provided crucial information about Gutian military capabilities, deployment patterns, and internal political tensions that could be exploited during the upcoming campaign. Networks of informants established within Gutian administrative hierarchies supplied detailed information about highland military strength, supply arrangements, and strategic priorities. This intelligence enabled Mesopotamian forces to concentrate their attacks against vulnerable targets while avoiding confrontations with superior Gutian forces that might jeopardize the overall campaign objectives. The religious legitimacy that Utu-Hegel cultivated throughout his rise to power provided essential ideological foundation for mobilizing widespread Mesopotamian support against Gutian rule. Unlike purely military leaders who relied primarily on force and personal charisma, Utu-Hegel systematically associated his political authority with traditional Mesopotamian religious institutions and theological concepts that resonated with populations throughout the region. Royal inscriptions from this period emphasize his role as defender of Mesopotamian civilization and restorer of proper relationships between human communities and divine authorities. Temple support for Utu-Hegel's anti-Gutian campaign provided both material resources and ideological legitimacy that proved crucial for sustaining extended military operations. Religious institutions throughout southern Mesopotamia contributed financial support, supplies, and personnel for military activities, while simultaneously conducting ceremonial activities that portrayed the campaign as divinely sanctioned restoration of proper political order. Archaeological evidence from temple complexes shows intensive production of military equipment and supplies during this period, often conducted within religious workshops that could operate without attracting Gutian administrative attention. The theological framework developed to justify Utu-Hegel's campaign drew upon traditional Mesopotamian concepts of divine kingship while adapting these ideas to contemporary political circumstances. Religious texts from this period portray Gutian rule as a temporary punishment inflicted by the gods for previous Mesopotamian failures, with Utu-Hegel's resistance representing divinely authorized restoration of proper political relationships. This theological interpretation provided moral justification for rebellion against established authority while maintaining respect for traditional concepts of legitimate governance. Coalition building among Sumerian city-states required diplomatic skills that transcended traditional interurban rivalries and competition for regional dominance. Utu-Hegel's success in creating effective military alliances stemmed from his ability to convince potential partners that Gutian rule represented a greater threat to their long-term interests than temporary subordination to Uruk's leadership. Archaeological evidence from various southern Mesopotamian sites shows coordinated military preparations during this period, including standardization of equipment and tactical methods that indicate systematic cooperation rather than independent parallel activities. The diplomatic negotiations that created Utu-Hegel's anti-Gutian coalition involved complex arrangements for resource sharing, command authority, and territorial arrangements following successful completion of the campaign. Administrative tablets from participating cities document detailed agreements regarding military contributions, supply responsibilities, and distribution of captured territories and resources. These arrangements required sophisticated legal frameworks that balanced individual city-state interests with collective campaign objectives while maintaining operational security against potential Gutian intelligence gathering. Military coordination among coalition forces required innovative command structures that could integrate different military traditions and tactical preferences while maintaining unified strategic direction. Utu-Hegel's solution involved creating joint command councils that included representatives from major participating cities while reserving ultimate strategic authority for Uruk's leadership. This arrangement provided participating cities with voice in campaign planning, while ensuring decisive leadership during critical tactical situations. The training programs implemented to prepare coalition forces for anti-Gutian operations drew upon military expertise accumulated during decades of resistance activities, while incorporating new tactical innovations specifically developed for the upcoming campaign. Archaeological evidence from training facilities shows standardized weapon designs and tactical equipment that enabled forces from different cities to operate as integrated units. The scale of these preparations indicates months of intensive coordination and resource mobilization that transformed individual city-state militias into a unified military force capable of sustained operations against professional Gutian armies. Tiragan's position as the last major Gutian king placed him at the center of Highland efforts to maintain political control over Mesopotamian territories that were increasingly contested by resurgent Sumerian forces. Archaeological evidence from sites under his control shows intensive military preparations and defensive construction projects that indicate clear recognition of the growing threat posed by Utu-Hagel's coalition. Administrative tablets from the final years of Gutian rule document emergency mobilization measures and resource concentration efforts that demonstrate the pressure facing highland authorities during this period. The territorial extent of Tiragan's authority appears to have been significantly reduced compared to earlier Gutian rulers, with effective control limited primarily to northern Mesopotamian regions where highland settlement had been most intensive. Southern territories that had been contested throughout the Gutian period increasingly fell under the influence of Mesopotamian resistance leaders, creating a fragmented political landscape that complicated defensive coordination. Archaeological surveys from this period show abandonment of many Gutian administrative centres in southern regions, suggesting strategic withdrawal rather than comprehensive territorial defence. Tiragan's military resources reflected both the traditional strengths of Gutian forces and the accumulated effects of decades of territorial occupation and resistance warfare. Highland military units retained their traditional advantages in mobility and individual combat effectiveness, but prolonged occupation duties had reduced their numbers and diluted their tactical cohesion. The integration of Mesopotamian military personnel and techniques had created hybrid forces that possessed certain advantages in lowland warfare but lacked the unified command structure and tactical coordination that had characterized earlier Gutian military organization. The defensive preparations undertaken by Tiragan's forces reveal sophisticated understanding of Mesopotamian military capabilities and strategic objectives. Fortification projects from this period show innovative combinations of highland fortress design with lowland siege defense techniques, creating defensive installations that were specifically adapted to counter-anticipated Sumerian tactical methods. Archaeological evidence from these fortifications indicates substantial investment in defensive preparations, though the resources available for such projects were clearly limited by the reduced territorial base under Gutian control. Intelligence operations conducted by Tiragan's administration provided detailed information about Utu-Hagel's military preparations and coalition-building activities, enabling Highland forces to develop countermeasures against anticipated Sumerian tactical innovations. Administrative tablets from this period document systematic surveillance of Mesopotamian military activities and diplomatic negotiations, though the information obtained appears to have been insufficient to prevent effective Sumerian coordination. The intelligence gathered by Gutian forces enabled tactical adaptations, but could not address the fundamental strategic disadvantages facing Highland authorities during this period. The decisive campaign that culminated in Tiragan's defeat around 2112 BC represented the culmination of decades of Mesopotamian resistance and military preparation, combined with systematic exploitation of Gutian political and military vulnerabilities. Utu-Hagel's strategic approach emphasized rapid movement and concentrated attacks that prevented effective Gutian defensive coordination, while maintaining pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously. Archaeological evidence from battlefield sites associated with this campaign shows clear tactical innovations that maximized Mesopotamian advantages while negating traditional Highland military strengths. The opening phases of Utu-Hagel's campaign focused on isolating Gutian strongholds from mutual support, while systematically reducing Highland control over key transportation routes and communication networks. Mesopotamian forces employed coordinated attacks against multiple targets simultaneously, preventing Gutian commanders from concentrating their forces for effective defensive operations. The speed and coordination of these initial operations demonstrates sophisticated logistical planning and tactical execution that reflected months of detailed preparation and intelligence gathering. Siege operations conducted during the campaign reveal significant innovations in Mesopotamian military engineering that enabled rapid reduction of fortified positions without the prolonged operations that had characterized earlier lowland siege warfare. Archaeological evidence from captured Gutian fortifications shows evidence of new siege techniques that emphasized speed and surprise rather than gradual attrition through blockade and starvation. These tactical innovations enabled Mesopotamian forces to maintain operational momentum while preventing Gutian forces from regrouping for coordinated counterattacks. The final confrontation between Utu-Hagel's forces and Tirigan's army occurred in circumstances that maximized Mesopotamian tactical advantages while limiting Gutian opportunities to employ their traditional military strengths. Contemporary sources indicate that the decisive battle took place in terrain that favoured coordinated formation fighting over the individual combat skills and mobility that had traditionally given Highland forces their military edge. The tactical deployment employed by Mesopotamian forces demonstrated sophisticated understanding of battlefield dynamics and enemy capabilities that enabled decisive victory despite numerical disadvantages. Tirigan's capture during the final battle marked the effective end of organised Gutian resistance and the collapse of Highland political authority throughout Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence from the immediate aftermath shows systematic destruction of Gutian administrative centres and military installations, indicating coordinated efforts to eliminate the infrastructure that had sustained Highland rule. The speed with which Gutian authority collapsed following Tirigan's defeat suggests that Highland political control had been maintained primarily through military force rather than genuine administrative integration with Mesopotamian society. The immediate aftermath of the Gutian defeat created complex challenges for Utu-Hagel's administration, as victorious Mesopotamian forces had to establish effective governance over territories that had experienced decades of political fragmentation and economic disruption. The restoration of traditional Mesopotamian administrative systems required reconstruction of bureaucratic institutions, legal frameworks, and economic relationships that had been modified or abandoned during the period of Highland rule. Archaeological evidence from administrative centres shows intensive reconstruction activities during the immediate post-Gutian period, indicating systematic efforts to restore traditional governmental functions. The treatment of surviving Gutian populations following their military defeat reveals Utu-Hagel's sophisticated approach to political consolidation that balanced demands for retribution with practical requirements for territorial integration. Rather than implementing wholesale expulsion or extermination policies, Mesopotamian authorities generally allowed Gutian communities to remain in territories where they had established permanent settlements, while requiring political submission and cultural accommodation to restored Mesopotamian authority. This approach minimized ongoing resistance while preserving valuable population and economic resources. Administrative reconstruction under Utu-Hagel's leadership drew upon both traditional Mesopotamian governmental practices and innovations developed during the resistance period that had proven effective for coordinating activities across extensive territories. The bureaucratic systems established during this period combined centralized strategic planning with decentralized operational implementation, creating administrative structures that could respond effectively to local conditions while maintaining overall policy coordination. Archaeological evidence from administrative sites shows rapid restoration of record-keeping systems and bureaucratic procedures that had been disrupted during the Gutian period. Economic recovery following the Gutian defeat required systematic reconstruction of commercial networks, agricultural systems, and craft production facilities that had been disrupted during decades of political instability. Utu-Hagel's administration implemented policies that encouraged restoration of traditional economic activities while incorporating beneficial innovations that had emerged during the period of Highland rule. Archaeological evidence from commercial centres shows rapid resumption of long-distance trade relationships and restoration of specialised craft production that had declined during the Gutian period. The transition from Utu-Hegel's rule to the subsequent administration of Ur-Nammu occurred through carefully managed succession arrangements that preserved political stability while enabling territorial expansion and administrative consolidation. Archaeological evidence suggests that this transition involved systematic transfer of governmental institutions and military command structures, rather than the political disruption that might have been expected from dynastic change. The continuity maintained during this succession process enabled continued expansion of Mesopotamian political control and systematic elimination of remaining Gutian influence throughout the region. The expulsion of Tirigan and the collapse of Gutian political authority created an immediate need for Mesopotamian scribes and administrators to construct historical narratives that would explain the century-long period of highland dominance while legitimizing the restored Sumerian political order. The literary traditions that emerged during the Ur III period and continued through subsequent Mesopotamian dynasties established interpretive frameworks that fundamentally shaped how later civilizations understood the Gutian period, often prioritizing ideological messaging over accurate historical documentation. The Sumerian king list, compiled during the reign of Utu-Hegel's successors, presents the most influential early interpretation of Gutian rule through its characterization of the Highland period as an illegitimate interruption of divinely sanctioned Mesopotamian kingship. The text's famous description of the Gutians as the fanged serpent of the mountains, who carried off the kingship to the mountains, established a literary template that portrayed Highland rule as fundamentally foreign and destructive to proper civilizational order. This characterization served multiple ideological purposes for restored Mesopotamian authorities, justifying their military campaigns while emphasizing the divine approval of their political legitimacy. The chronological framework provided by the Sumerian king list reflects deliberate editorial choices that minimize the apparent duration and significance of Gutian achievements while emphasizing the temporary nature of their political authority. The list's attribution of brief reigns to individual Gutian rulers created an impression of political instability and illegitimate authority that contrasted sharply with the lengthy reigns attributed to traditional Mesopotamian monarchs. Archaeological evidence suggests that this chronological compression may have significantly understated the actual duration of Highland rule while obscuring periods of relative stability under certain Gutian leaders. Contemporary administrative documents from the Ur III period reveal systematic efforts to erase or reinterpret physical evidence of Gutian governmental achievements that might have challenged the narrative of Highland incompetence and destructiveness. Building inscriptions from this period often claim credit for construction projects that archaeological evidence suggests were actually completed during the Gutian period, while modifications to existing structures removed or obscured architectural elements that reflected Highland design influences. These editorial activities demonstrate conscious historical revisionism designed to support preferred interpretations of recent events. The Curse of Akkad, composed during the earlier III period, established theological interpretations of the Gutian invasion that became foundational for later Mesopotamian understanding of Highland rule. The text's portrayal of Gutian dominance as divine punishment for Naram-Sin's sacrilege at Nippur provided religious explanation for Akkadian collapse while simultaneously justifying Sumerian political restoration. This theological framework enabled Mesopotamian audiences to understand their recent historical experiences within familiar religious categories, while maintaining traditional concepts of divine justice and political legitimacy. Literary elaborations of the Curse of Akkad throughout subsequent periods added increasingly dramatic details about Gutian destructiveness and barbarism that reflected contemporary political concerns rather than historical accuracy. Later versions of the text described wholesale destruction of cities, systematic elimination of civilized practices, and deliberate attacks on religious institutions that archaeological evidence does not support. These embellishments serve contemporary propaganda purposes while creating lasting impressions of Gutian rule that influenced historical understanding for millennia. The lamentation literature that flourished during the Earth III and Old Babylonian periods incorporated references to the Gutian period that emphasized themes of foreign destruction and cultural disruption, while largely ignoring evidence of administrative continuity and cultural accommodation. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur, though primarily concerned with later Elamite attacks, contains passages that appear to conflate different periods of foreign domination, creating composite images of destruction that attributed various historical disasters to Gutian activities. These literary conflations demonstrate how contemporary political concerns shaped historical memory, rather than preserving accurate documentation of past events. Religious texts from the Old Babylonian period systematically portrayed Gutian rule as a period of religious disruption and divine abandonment that contrasted with the pious restoration achieved by Mesopotamian rulers. Temple hymns and ritual texts from this period describe the Gutian era as a time when proper religious observances ceased and divine favour was withdrawn from the land. Archaeological evidence from temple complexes suggests that religious activities continued throughout the Gutian period, though possibly with modified practices and reduced resources. The literary emphasis on religious disruption served to legitimize restored Mesopotamian authority, while emphasizing the divine approval of traditional political arrangements. Wisdom literature from the Middle Babylonian period incorporated references to the Gutian period that transformed historical events into moral lessons about the consequences of political disorder and foreign domination. Texts such as the Advice to a Prince use the Gutian example to illustrate proper royal behaviour and the importance of maintaining traditional governmental practices. These didactic uses of historical material prioritize moral instruction over historical accuracy, creating simplified narratives that emphasized clear distinctions between proper and improper political authority. The development of historical consciousness during the Neo-Assyrian period led to more sophisticated treatments of the Gutian period that attempted to integrate Highland rule into broader narratives of Mesopotamian political development. Royal inscriptions from this period occasionally acknowledged Gutian achievements while maintaining overall negative assessments of Highland authority. Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh contained copies of earlier texts about the Gutian period, alongside contemporary historical analyses that attempted to understand the causes and consequences of Highland dominance within broader patterns of political change. Assyrian royal ideology incorporated lessons drawn from the Gutian period into contemporary political discourse that emphasized the importance of strong central authority and effective military organization. Royal inscriptions from the Neo-Assyrian period often contrasted Assyrian governmental achievements with the chaos and weakness attributed to earlier periods of foreign domination. These comparisons served contemporary propaganda purposes while demonstrating how historical memory was continuously reinterpreted to support current political objectives. The historiographical treatment of the Gutians in later Babylonian royal inscriptions reveals evolving attitudes toward Highland peoples that reflected changing political circumstances and diplomatic relationships. Early Neo-Babylonian texts maintained traditional negative characterizations of Gutian rule, while emphasizing Babylonian achievements in restoring proper governmental authority. However, later texts from periods when Babylonian rulers maintained diplomatic relationships with Highland peoples occasionally adopted more neutral language that acknowledged Gutian military capabilities without endorsing their political legitimacy. Nebuchadnezzar II's building inscriptions demonstrate sophisticated understanding of historical precedent that drew upon Gutian period examples to justify contemporary construction projects and administrative policies. These texts occasionally acknowledge that certain architectural innovations or administrative practices had origins during the Highland period, while maintaining overall emphasis on Babylonian cultural superiority. This selective acknowledgement of Gutian contributions represents a more nuanced approach to historical interpretation that recognized practical achievements while maintaining ideological distinctions. Chronicle literature from the late Babylonian period attempted to provide more objective historical accounts that included the Gutian period within broader chronological frameworks of Mesopotamian political development. The Babylonian Chronicle series incorporated information about Gutian rulers and their achievements alongside traditional negative assessments of Highland authority. These texts demonstrate evolving historical methodology that attempted to balance ideological concerns with documentary accuracy, though contemporary political considerations continue to influence historical interpretation. The treatment of Gutian military capabilities in later Babylonian historical texts reveals recognition of Highland tactical innovations and organizational achievements that had been largely ignored in earlier literary sources. Military manuals and tactical treatises from the Neo-Babylonian period occasionally referenced Gutian military methods as examples of effective techniques for specific battlefield situations. This acknowledgement of Gutian military expertise represents a significant departure from earlier characterizations that emphasized Highland barbarism and tactical incompetence. Archaeological investigations conducted throughout the 20th and 21st centuries have systematically challenged many traditional assumptions about the nature and extent of cultural disruption during the Gutian period. Excavations at major Mesopotamian sites have revealed evidence for continuity in material culture, architectural traditions, and administrative practices that contradicts literary portrayals of wholesale destruction and cultural collapse. These archaeological findings have necessitated fundamental reconsideration of the Gutian period and its significance within broader patterns of Mesopotamian historical development. Stratigraphic analysis at sites such as Nippur, Babylon, and Eshnunna has documented gradual cultural changes during the Gutian period, rather than the sudden disruptions described in literary sources. Pottery assemblages show evolution of existing traditions rather than replacement by entirely foreign ceramic styles, while architectural remains demonstrate adaptive modifications of existing structures rather than wholesale reconstruction according to Highland principles. These archaeological patterns suggest cultural accommodation and gradual change rather than the dramatic cultural replacement described in traditional historical sources. Settlement pattern analysis throughout northern and central Mesopotamia has revealed complex demographic changes during the Gutian period that included both population movement and cultural adaptation, rather than simple conquest and occupation by Highland peoples. Archaeological surveys have documented new settlements that reflect Highland cultural traditions, alongside continued occupation of traditional Mesopotamian sites with modified material culture assemblages. These patterns suggest a more complex process of cultural interaction than the simple conquest narrative preserved in literary sources. Economic analysis based on archaeological evidence has challenged traditional assumptions about the extent of commercial disruption during the Gutian period. While long-distance trade networks clearly experienced significant disruption, archaeological assemblages from this period show continued local and regional exchange relationships that maintained many aspects of traditional Mesopotamian economic organization. The persistence of specialized craft production and standardized measurement systems indicates greater economic continuity than suggested by literary sources that emphasized complete commercial collapse. Modern scholarly debates about the Gutian period have increasingly focused on methodological questions about the relationship between literary sources and archaeological evidence in reconstructing ancient historical processes. The the significant discrepancies between traditional historical narratives and archaeological findings have highlighted the importance of ideological factors in shaping historical memory, while demonstrating the limitations of relying exclusively on literary sources for understanding complex historical phenomena. Comparative analysis with other periods of foreign domination in Mesopotamian history has provided new perspectives on the Gutian period that emphasize common patterns of cultural adaptation and political accommodation rather than unique characteristics of highland rule. Studies of later Elamite, Assyrian, and Persian dominance over Mesopotamian territories have revealed similar processes of administrative continuity, cultural syncretism, and gradual political integration that suggest the Gutian period followed typical patterns of ancient conquest and occupation rather than representing unprecedented cultural disruption. Anthropological approaches to understanding the Gutian period have emphasized the importance of tribal political organization and pastoral economic strategies in shaping highland administrative practices and cultural policies. These analytical frameworks have provided new insights into Gutian governmental methods and their relationships with conquered populations, while challenging traditional assumptions about the incompatibility of highland and lowland political systems. Linguistic analysis of Gutian personal names and administrative terminology preserved in Mesopotamian texts has revealed greater cultural sophistication and administrative complexity than suggested by traditional historical narratives. The systematic study of Gutian linguistic elements has provided evidence for structured governmental hierarchies and standardized administrative procedures that contradict literary characterizations of highland political chaos and administrative incompetence. Regional studies focusing on specific areas under Gutian control have revealed significant variations in highland administrative policies and cultural relationships that challenge generalizations based on limited literary sources. Archaeological investigations in the Diyala River Valley, northern Mesopotamian sites, and highland border regions have documented different patterns of cultural interaction and political organization that reflect local conditions and individual leadership decisions rather than uniform highland policies toward conquered populations. The reassessment of Gutian cultural achievements has led to broader reconsideration of traditional assumptions about the relationship between nomadic and sedentary societies in ancient Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence for technological innovations, architectural adaptations, and administrative developments during the Gutian period has demonstrated the creative potential of cultural interaction between different social systems while challenging evolutionary models that portrayed nomadic societies as inherently less sophisticated than sedentary civilizations. Contemporary scholarly consensus increasingly emphasizes the complexity of the Gutian period and the limitations of traditional historical interpretations that relied heavily on ideologically motivated literary sources. The integration of archaeological evidence with careful analysis of contemporary administrative documents has created more nuanced understanding of highland rule that recognizes both its disruptive effects and its contributions to Mesopotamian cultural and political development. This revised understanding has important implications for broader questions about cultural interaction, political legitimacy, and historical memory in ancient civilizations. The systematic expulsion of Gutian forces from Mesopotamian territories following Tirigan's defeat initiated a complex process of highland retreat that unfolded over several decades, rather than occurring as a single coordinated withdrawal. Archaeological evidence from sites along the traditional migration routes connecting Mesopotamia with the central Zagros mountain reveals a pattern of gradual abandonment of lowland settlements accompanied by the establishment of new highland communities that incorporated both traditional Gutian cultural elements and administrative innovations acquired during their century of territorial rule. The re-establishment of Gutian communities in their ancestral mountain territories required significant adaptations to accommodate populations that had spent generations in Mesopotamian environments and had developed hybrid cultural practices combining highland traditions with lowland administrative and technological knowledge. Excavations at sites such as Godin Tepe and Tepe Nushi Jan show clear evidence of architectural modifications during the late 3rd millennium BC that reflect the integration of Mesopotamian building techniques with traditional highland fortress designs, creating defensive installations that were more sophisticated than earlier mountain strongholds. The demographic changes accompanying the Gutian retreat created new settlement patterns throughout the central Zagros that differed markedly from the dispersed tribal communities that had characterized the region before the Mesopotamian adventure. Archaeological surveys have documented the establishment of larger, more centralized settlements that served as administrative centers for territories encompassing multiple traditional tribal domains. These consolidated settlements show evidence of planned construction with standardized building modules and coordinated infrastructure development that reflects organizational capabilities acquired through experience with Mesopotamian urban administration. Material culture assemblages from highland sites dating to the immediate post-expulsion period demonstrate the persistence of cultural innovations that had emerged during the period of lowland occupation. Pottery traditions show continued production of hybrid ceramic forms that combine traditional Zagros grey-black burnished wares with vessel shapes and decorative motifs derived from Mesopotamian prototypes. Metallurgical evidence indicates the adoption of bronze working techniques and tool designs that had been acquired through contact with lowland craft specialists, creating technological capabilities that enhanced highland economic productivity and military effectiveness. The social organization of re-established Gutian communities reveals fundamental changes from pre-conquest tribal structures that reflected both the demographic mixing that had occurred during the Mesopotamian period and the administrative experience gained through territorial governance. Traditional kinship-based leadership systems were modified to incorporate hierarchical, administrative positions that had proven effective during highland rule over sedentary populations. Archaeological evidence from residential areas shows greater social stratification than had characterized earlier highland communities, with elite compounds displaying architectural features and material culture assemblages that reflected accumulated wealth and administrative authority. Agricultural practices in the highland territories underwent significant modifications as returning Gutian populations attempted to apply irrigation techniques and crop management strategies that had been observed during their occupation of Mesopotamian territories. Terraced field systems constructed during this period show sophisticated engineering that combined traditional highland water management with lowland hydraulic principles, creating agricultural infrastructure that supported larger populations than had been sustainable under purely traditional subsistence strategies. The introduction of new crop varieties, particularly improved barley strains that had been developed in Mesopotamian agricultural centers, enhanced food security while reducing dependence on pastoral production. The integration of pastoral and agricultural activities within highland communities created economic systems that were more diversified and resilient than either pure nomadism or intensive cultivation. Archaeological evidence from storage facilities shows systematic management of both grain surpluses and livestock products, indicating planned economic strategies that maximized resource utilization while maintaining flexibility for seasonal migration and environmental adaptation. These hybrid economic systems provided foundation for sustained population growth and territorial expansion that would characterize later Gutian political development. Political reorganization within highland territories proceeded through gradual consolidation of traditional tribal authorities under leaders who had gained administrative experience during the Mesopotamian occupation. Rather than returning to purely traditional governance structures, Gutian communities developed political systems that incorporated bureaucratic elements alongside kinship-based authority relationships. Administrative tablets from highland sites, though less numerous than Mesopotamian archives, documents systematic record-keeping and resource management that demonstrates continued application of governmental techniques acquired through territorial administration. The relationship between different Gutian tribal groups underwent significant modification, as communities that had participated in Mesopotamian occupation developed new alliances and hierarchical relationships based on shared experiences and accumulated resources. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain groups that had achieved prominent positions during the Highland rule maintained superior status within the reorganized mountain communities, creating political hierarchies that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. These new political arrangements facilitated coordination among different Highland communities while maintaining sufficient flexibility to accommodate traditional cultural practices and seasonal migration patterns. Military organisation within Highland communities retained many innovations that had been developed during the Mesopotamian campaigns, while adapting these techniques to traditional mountain warfare requirements. Weapons assemblages from this period show continued production of bronze implements using techniques acquired through contact with lowland metalworkers, while fortification systems incorporated defensive principles learned through siege warfare experience. The combination of traditional Highland mobility with improved weapons technology and tactical knowledge created military capabilities that were superior to pre-conquest Highland forces. The persistence of Gutian political identity following their expulsion from Mesopotamia appears in various forms of cultural expression that maintained connections to the period of territorial rule while adapting to changed circumstances. Artistic traditions documented in archaeological assemblages show continued production of objects bearing iconographic elements that had been associated with Highland authority during the Mesopotamian period. These cultural markers served to maintain group identity and political legitimacy, while providing tangible connections to the achievements of the conquest period. Religious practices within Highland communities show evidence of syncretistic developments that incorporated Mesopotamian theological concepts with traditional mountain spiritual traditions. Archaeological evidence from ritual sites includes votive objects and architectural features that reflect exposure to lowland religious practices while maintaining fundamental Highland spiritual orientations toward natural landscape features. This religious syncretism created theological frameworks that could accommodate both traditional tribal spiritual needs and the more complex religious requirements of hierarchical political organisation. The economic relationships that developed between Highland Gutian communities and Mesopotamian city-states during the III period reveal pragmatic accommodation on both sides that transcended the military hostilities of the conquest and expulsion periods. Administrative tablets from Mesopotamian archives document trade relationships involving Highland products such as metals, livestock and forest materials in exchange for manufactured goods and agricultural surpluses. These commercial interactions provided economic benefits for both Highland and lowland communities, while creating diplomatic channels that reduced the likelihood of renewed military conflict. The three administrative records reveal sophisticated diplomatic protocols governing interactions with Highland Gutian communities that recognise their political autonomy while establishing frameworks for peaceful coexistence. Treaties documented in cuneiform archives established territorial boundaries, trade regulations, and dispute resolution mechanisms that enabled stable relationships despite the recent history of military conflict. These diplomatic arrangements demonstrate mutual recognition of legitimate interests and practical benefits from peaceful interaction rather than continued hostility. The military policies implemented by Eartha III rulers toward Highland territories show careful balance between defensive preparedness and diplomatic accommodation that reflected realistic assessment of Gutian military capabilities and the costs of sustained conflict. Fortification projects along the Mesopotamian Highland frontier focused on defensive installations rather than offensive bases, indicating strategic priorities that emphasized territorial security rather than renewed conquest attempts. Archaeological evidence from border regions shows coordinated defensive planning that could respond effectively to potential highland raids while avoiding provocative deployments that might encourage renewed conflict. Economic integration between highland and lowland regions during the Ur-3 period created mutually beneficial relationships that provided highland communities with access to Mesopotamian manufactured goods while supplying lowland cities with essential raw materials unavailable in alluvial territories. Trade route security became a shared concern that encouraged cooperation between highland and lowland authorities in suppressing banditry and maintaining commercial infrastructure. Archaeological evidence from trading centres shows increased commercial activity and improved security arrangements that benefited both highland and lowland economic interests. The gradual integration of highland territories into broader regional political systems accelerated during the Old Babylonian period, as Mesopotamian political fragmentation created opportunities for highland communities to establish advantageous relationships with competing lowland powers. Administrative documents from various Mesopotamian archives document highland military service in lowland armies, diplomatic marriages between highland and lowland elite families, and commercial partnerships that created cross-cutting loyalties and interests. These relationships facilitated highland political development while providing lowland rulers with access to highland military expertise and economic resources. Hammurabi's law code contains provisions that specifically address relationships with highland peoples, indicating systematic legal frameworks that governed interactions between sedentary and pastoral populations within the expanded Babylonian territorial system. These legal provisions recognize highland customary practices while establishing Babylonian judicial authority over certain categories of disputes and criminal activities. The inclusion of such provisions demonstrates highland integration into Babylonian political and legal systems while maintaining recognition of cultural distinctiveness and traditional governance practices. Archaeological evidence from highland sites during the Old Babylonian period shows continued cultural development that incorporated Mesopotamian influences while maintaining distinctive highland characteristics. Architectural traditions show increasing sophistication in construction techniques and urban planning that reflects both indigenous development and continued contact with lowland building practices. Material culture assemblages demonstrate growing prosperity and technological advancement, while maintaining cultural markers that preserved highland identity within broader regional political systems. The Middle Assyrian period witnessed significant changes in highland-lowland relationships, as Assyrian territorial expansion brought highland communities under more direct imperial administration, while recognizing their military value and strategic importance. Assyrian royal inscriptions document highland military units serving in imperial armies and highland nobles holding administrative positions within the imperial bureaucracy. These developments indicate successful integration of highland populations into Assyrian political systems while maintaining their distinctive cultural characteristics and specialized military capabilities. Highland military service in Assyrian armies provided opportunities for cultural exchange and technological transfer that enhanced highland capabilities while contributing to Assyrian military effectiveness. Archaeological evidence from highland sites during this period shows adoption of Assyrian military technologies and tactical innovations, alongside continued development of traditional highland warfare techniques. The combination of imperial military training with indigenous tactical knowledge created highland military capabilities that were valued throughout the ancient Near East. Administrative integration during the Neo-Assyrian period involved systematic incorporation of highland territories into imperial provincial systems, while maintaining recognition of traditional leadership structures and cultural practices. Assyrian administrative tablets document highland governors and officials who combined traditional tribal authority with imperial administrative responsibilities. This dual administrative system enabled effective imperial control while preserving highland social organization and cultural identity within the broader imperial framework. The Persian period marked the culmination of Highland political integration, as the Achaemenid Empire created administrative systems that effectively incorporated Highland territories while recognising their strategic importance and cultural distinctiveness. Persian administrative documents from Persepolis include references to Highland administrative units and military contingents that demonstrate systematic integration into imperial governmental structures. Archaeological evidence from Highland sites shows continued prosperity and cultural development under Persian administration, indicating successful accommodation between imperial requirements and Highland interests. Highland military contributions to Persian imperial armies included specialised units that maintained traditional tactical capabilities while adapting to imperial strategic requirements. Classical sources document Highland cavalry and infantry formations serving in major Persian military campaigns throughout the Mediterranean and Central Asian regions. These military deployments provided Highland communities with opportunities for territorial expansion and economic advancement, while contributing to Persian imperial military effectiveness. The cultural continuity documented in Highland archaeological sites throughout the 2nd and 1st millennia BC demonstrates the persistence of distinctive Gutian cultural traditions despite political integration into various imperial systems. Pottery traditions, architectural styles, and religious practices show evolutionary development that maintained fundamental Highland characteristics while incorporating influences from contact with various political and cultural systems. This cultural persistence indicates successful adaptation strategies that enabled Highland communities to maintain their identity while participating effectively in broader regional political and economic systems. Linguistic evidence from Highland regions during the later periods suggests the continued use of languages related to the original Gutian tongue alongside the adoption of various imperial languages for administrative and commercial purposes. Personal names preserved in administrative documents show persistence of traditional Highland naming patterns while demonstrating familiarity with Mesopotamian, Persian, and other regional linguistic traditions. This linguistic diversity indicates cultural sophistication that enabled effective participation in multilingual imperial systems while maintaining traditional cultural markers. The archaeological record from Highland sites during the Hellenistic and Parthian periods shows continued cultural development and political autonomy within broader imperial frameworks that recognised Highland's strategic importance and military capabilities. Fortification systems from these periods demonstrate sophisticated military engineering that combine traditional Highland defensive principles with innovations derived from contact with various imperial military traditions. These defensive installations indicate continued political significance and military effectiveness that enabled Highland communities to maintain advantageous relationships with successive imperial powers. Settlement patterns throughout the Highland regions during the later periods show continued population growth and territorial expansion that built upon the demographic and political foundations established during the original Mesopotamian occupation. Archaeological surveys document the establishment of new settlements and the expansion of existing communities throughout previously marginal Highland territories. This territorial expansion indicates successful adaptation to changing political and economic conditions, while maintaining the cultural and political distinctiveness that had characterized Highland communities since their return from Mesopotamian territories. The reassessment of Gutian contributions to Mesopotamian civilization has undergone dramatic transformation as archaeological evidence has systematically challenged traditional literary portrayals of Highland rule as purely destructive and culturally barren. Contemporary scholarly analysis reveals that the Gutian period, rather than representing a complete break with Mesopotamian administrative traditions, actually fostered significant innovations in governmental organisation that would influence subsequent political developments throughout the ancient Near East. The administrative systems that emerged during Highland rule combined traditional Mesopotamian bureaucratic expertise with Highland organizational principles that emphasize flexibility and adaptation to local conditions, creating hybrid governmental structures that proved remarkably resilient and effective. Administrative tablets from sites such as Nutsi and Pusrish Dagan demonstrate that Gutian rulers implemented systematic record-keeping procedures that maintained essential governmental functions while introducing innovations in resource management and territorial administration. The tribute collection systems developed during this period established standardized assessment procedures and regular collection schedules that provided more predictable revenue streams than the ad hoc taxation methods that had characterized earlier Mesopotamian administrative practice. These innovations required sophisticated understanding of local economic conditions and administrative capabilities that contradicts traditional characterizations of Highland governmental incompetence. The integration of Highland and Lowland administrative personnel created training opportunities that enhanced the technical capabilities of both groups, while facilitating knowledge transfer between different governmental traditions. Mesopotamian scribes working within Gutian administrative systems gained exposure to Highland organizational methods that emphasized personal relationships and flexible response to changing conditions, while Highland administrators acquired technical skills in record-keeping, legal documentation, and resource management that enhanced their governmental effectiveness. This cross-cultural administrative training created a pool of experienced personnel whose expertise would prove valuable for subsequent Mesopotamian dynasties. Territorial administration during the Gutian period established precedents for decentralized governance that would influence later Mesopotamian political organization. Rather than attempting to impose uniform administrative procedures throughout their territories, Gutian rulers developed flexible systems that adapted to local conditions while maintaining overall policy coordination. This approach required sophisticated communication networks and standardized reporting procedures that enabled central authorities to monitor regional developments while allowing local administrators sufficient autonomy to respond effectively to immediate challenges. The administrative infrastructure created during this period provided foundations for the territorial expansion and governmental sophistication that would characterize the Ur-III dynasty. Cultural exchange during the Gutian period facilitated technological and artistic innovations that enriched Mesopotamian civilization, while introducing Highland cultural elements that enhanced the diversity and adaptability of lowland society. Metallurgical techniques developed through Highland-Lowland collaboration produced superior bronze alloys and improved weapon designs that enhanced Mesopotamian military capabilities. Architectural innovations that combined Highland fortress design principles with lowland construction techniques created defensive installations that were more effective against siege warfare than traditional Mesopotamian fortifications. These technological advances demonstrate the greater potential of cultural interaction between different social systems. Artistic traditions that emerged during the Gutian period show sophisticated blending of Highland and Lowland aesthetic principles that created new forms of cultural expression while preserving essential elements of both traditions. Pottery assemblages from this period display technical innovations in firing techniques and decorative methods that enhanced both functional effectiveness and aesthetic appeal. Cylinder seal designs show incorporation of Highland iconographic elements alongside traditional Mesopotamian religious and political symbols, creating artistic traditions that reflected the complex cultural dynamics of the period. These artistic developments demonstrate cultural creativity rather than the artistic stagnation that traditional historical narratives have suggested. The Gutian period represents a compelling case study in ancient imperialism that reveals the complex dynamics of cultural contact and political transformation that characterized interactions between nomadic and sedentary societies throughout the ancient world. Unlike conquest situations that involved replacement of existing populations, or wholesale imposition of foreign cultural systems, the Gutian occupation of Mesopotamia created conditions for sustained cultural interaction that produced hybrid institutions and practices that combined elements from both traditions. This pattern of cultural accommodation and institutional adaptation provides insights into the mechanisms through which political authority was established and maintained in ancient multi-ethnic societies. Comparative analysis with other instances of nomadic conquest in the ancient Near East reveals that the Gutian approach to territorial administration followed patterns that were common among highland peoples who established control over sedentary populations. The emphasis on tribute extraction rather than direct administrative control, the retention of existing local officials under highland supervision, and the adaptation of traditional nomadic leadership structures to territorial governance requirements all appear in similar conquest situations throughout the region. These commonalities suggest that the Gutian administrative methods reflected sophisticated understanding of the practical requirements for maintaining political control over culturally different populations. The relationship between military conquest and cultural transformation during the Gutian period demonstrates the limitations of purely military approaches to political control, while highlighting the importance of cultural accommodation for sustainable governance. The initial military success that established Gutian dominance over Mesopotamian territories required adaptation of highland warfare techniques to lowland conditions, while the maintenance of political authority necessitated accommodation with existing social structures and cultural practices. The eventual collapse of Gutian political control resulted partly from their inability to achieve complete cultural integration while maintaining sufficient military effectiveness to resist organized opposition. Political transformation during the Gutian period involved complex negotiations between different concepts of legitimate authority that reflected both highland tribal traditions and Mesopotamian monarchical principles. Gutian rulers had to establish credibility within highland tribal systems that emphasized personal achievement and consensus building, while simultaneously claiming authority over Mesopotamian populations accustomed to hierarchical governmental structures and religious legitimation of political power. The hybrid political systems that emerged from these negotiations created precedents for multi-ethnic governance that would influence subsequent political developments throughout the region. Modern archaeological discoveries have fundamentally altered scholarly understanding of Gutian society and governance through systematic excavation of highland sites and careful analysis of material culture assemblages that reveal the complexity and sophistication of highland political organization. Excavations at Godin Tepe have uncovered administrative complexes that demonstrate systematic governmental organization and sophisticated record-keeping capabilities that contradict traditional assumptions about nomadic political simplicity. Storage facilities and workshop areas show evidence of coordinated resource management and specialized craft production that indicate economic complexity comparable to contemporary Mesopotamian city-states. Fortification systems discovered at highland sites reveal military engineering capabilities that combine traditional mountain fortress design with innovations derived from contact with Mesopotamian siege warfare techniques. The defensive installations at sites such as Tepe Nush-i Jan show sophisticated understanding of terrain utilization and coordinated defensive planning that enabled effective resistance to superior enemy forces. These archaeological discoveries demonstrate that highland military capabilities extended beyond individual combat effectiveness, to include systematic defensive planning and coordinated tactical operations that required substantial organizational sophistication. Settlement pattern analysis throughout the central Zagros Mountains has revealed complex demographic and political relationships among highland communities that supported the large-scale military operations required for Mesopotamian conquest and occupation. Archaeological surveys have documented hierarchical settlement systems with major centres that served administrative and military coordination functions for extensive territories encompassing multiple tribal domains. These settlement patterns indicate political organisation that transcended traditional tribal boundaries while maintaining sufficient flexibility to accommodate seasonal migration and environmental adaptation requirements. Material culture studies have provided detailed insights into highland social organisation and economic systems that reveal the foundations for successful territorial expansion and sustained political control over Mesopotamian populations. Pottery traditions show standardised production techniques and distribution networks that indicate coordinated economic planning and systematic resource management. Metallurgical evidence demonstrates sophisticated technical knowledge and organised production systems that supplied military equipment and trade goods for both highland consumption and export to lowland markets. These archaeological findings reveal economic and social complexity that provided essential support for highland political and military achievements. Comparative analysis of the Gutian invasion with other instances of barbarian incursions into civilized territories throughout ancient Near Eastern history reveals both common patterns and distinctive characteristics that illuminate the dynamics of cultural contact and political transformation in the ancient world. The Gutian occupation of Mesopotamia shares certain features with later Aramean migrations, Elamite invasions, and Persian conquests, including emphasis on tribute extraction, retention of existing administrative personnel, and gradual cultural accommodation between conquerors and conquered populations. However, the Gutian case differs from other conquest situations in several important respects that reflect the specific characteristics of highland-lowland interaction and the particular historical circumstances of late 3rd millennium Mesopotamia. The extended duration of Gutian political control, lasting over a century, provided opportunities for cultural integration and institutional development that were not available in shorter conquest episodes. The geographical proximity of highland and lowland territories facilitated ongoing cultural exchange and population movement that created more complex patterns of cultural interaction than occurred in conquests involving more distant populations. The relationship between environmental factors and political developments during the Gutian period demonstrates the importance of ecological considerations in understanding ancient political transformations. The pastoral economy that sustained highland populations required access to seasonal grazing areas and water sources that could be obtained through territorial expansion into Mesopotamian regions. Simultaneously, the agricultural systems that supported Mesopotamian urban populations required maintenance of irrigation infrastructure and coordination of cultivation activities that highland administrators had to master for effective territorial governance. The interaction between these different environmental adaptations created both opportunities and constraints that shaped political developments throughout the period. Climate change during the late 3rd millennium BC may have contributed to the conditions that enabled Gutian territorial expansion, while simultaneously creating challenges for maintaining political control over Mesopotamian territories. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests periods of reduced precipitation that would have affected both highland pastoral activities and lowland agricultural productivity, creating incentives for population movement and territorial competition. The ability of Gutian administrative systems to adapt to changing environmental conditions while maintaining political stability demonstrates governmental flexibility that enabled survival under challenging circumstances. The Gutian experience provides insights into the processes through which nomadic societies adapted to the requirements of governing sedentary populations while maintaining their cultural identity and traditional social organisation. The administrative innovations that emerged during highland rule of Mesopotamia demonstrate creative solutions to the practical challenges of territorial governance that drew upon both nomadic organisational principles and sedentary administrative techniques. These hybrid governmental systems created precedents for multi-ethnic political organisation that would influence subsequent developments throughout the ancient Near East. Military innovations that emerged during the Gutian period reflect successful adaptation of highland warfare techniques to lowland strategic requirements, while maintaining the tactical advantages that had enabled initial conquest success. The integration of highland mobility and individual combat skills with Mesopotamian siege capabilities and logistical organisation created military systems that were superior to either tradition alone. These military developments demonstrate the potential for technological and tactical innovation that could result from cultural contact between different military traditions. The scholarly consensus that has emerged from decades of archaeological research and textual analysis emphasizes the complexity of the Gutian period and the limitations of traditional historical interpretations that relied primarily on ideologically motivated literary sources. Contemporary understanding recognizes the Gutian century as a period of significant cultural interaction and institutional innovation, rather than simple destruction and cultural regression. This revised interpretation has important implications for broader questions about the relationship between nomadic and sedentary societies, the dynamics of cultural change, and the processes through which political authority was established and maintained in the ancient world. The integration of archaeological evidence with careful analysis of contemporary administrative documents has created more nuanced understanding of highland rule that recognizes both its disruptive effects on existing political and economic systems and its contributions to Mesopotamian institutional development. The administrative innovations, cultural exchanges, and technological developments that occurred during the Gutian period provided foundations for subsequent political achievements, while demonstrating the creative potential of cultural interaction between different social systems. The Gutian legacy in Mesopotamian civilization extends far beyond the immediate political and military events of their century-long rule to encompass lasting contributions to governmental organization, military technology, and cultural expression that influenced subsequent developments throughout the ancient Near East. The administrative systems, architectural innovations, and artistic traditions that emerged during highland rule provided precedents and technical knowledge that enhanced the capabilities of later Mesopotamian dynasties, while demonstrating the benefits of cultural accommodation and institutional adaptation in multi-ethnic political systems. Modern understanding of the Gutian period continues to evolve as new archaeological discoveries provide additional evidence for the complexity and significance of highland contributions to Mesopotamian civilization. The systematic reassessment of traditional historical narratives has revealed the extent to which ideological considerations shaped ancient historical memory, while obscuring the actual achievements and innovations that occurred during periods of foreign rule. This ongoing scholarly revision demonstrates the importance of combining multiple types of evidence in reconstructing ancient historical processes, while remaining aware of the ways in which contemporary concerns and assumptions can influence historical interpretation. The story of the Gutians ultimately illustrates the dynamic nature of ancient civilizations and their capacity for adaptation, innovation, and cultural synthesis in response to changing political and environmental conditions. Their century of rule over Mesopotamia, far from representing a dark age of cultural stagnation, emerges as a period of significant institutional development and cultural creativity that contributed to the ongoing evolution of one of humanity's earliest and most influential civilizations. The highland peoples, who descended from the Zagros Mountains, not only conquered and governed Mesopotamian territories, but also participated in the continuous process of cultural development that made ancient Mesopotamia a crucible of human innovation and achievement.